Chapter 725. The things that need to be said have already been said by many people. There's no need to say anything more. Fan Xian smiled and patted Yi Ling'er's shoulder. Between the two of them, there was never anything to worry about. Yi Ling'er did not raise her brows out of habit. On the contrary, the expression on her face dimmed slightly. There are always discussions in the family that burrow into my ears. Although I don't want to hear these things, Father is very angry about what happened in the north. She looked at Fan Xian wanting to say something but then stopped. A moment later she said seriously, "After all, you and I are both Qing people." Fan Xian nodded and didn't say anything, but his smile was slightly bitter. After the member of the Qinian unit he had sent to Dongyi met with Mu Feng, he passed on his will, causing the turmoil in the Liang kingdom to reignite. From there he thought of a way to resist the court's edict and allow the great prince to stay in Dongyi. However, Northern Qi's reaction was truly beyond Fan Xian's expectations. Calculating the time, Wang Qinian should have just arrived in Shangjing. In the message he had him bring, there was no intention for Northern Qi to send out a large number of troops. He only asked the little emperor to help Dongyi for the sake of their relationship. There were many ways to help. Northern Qi's method was, without question, the most open and honorable. It was also the kind that put Fan Xian in the most awkward position. He broke free from his thoughts. As he picked at the coal, he quietly chatted with Yi Ling'er. He wanted to understand from the bits and pieces of conversation in the Yi manor whether or not there was any movement from the Bureau of Military Affairs. The emperor's reaction to the northern battle was too indifferent. It was so indifferent that Fan Xian smelled a glimmer of danger. However, he didn't know where this scent landed. A few days after the winter solstice, the Fan Manor held another family banquet. This time, the family banquet was not like Prince Heching's manor, where the younger generation of the royal family were invited. It was a pure family banquet. Other than the master of the manor, the only guests were Fan Xian's 4 disciples. Yang Wanli had been thrown into prison from his position as vice minister of the Ministry of Works. He had received heavy punishment in prison. After the Supreme Court's verdict, he had been taken back to the manor by Fan Xian to recover. Even now it was difficult for him to move. The resentful expression on his face had long faded. He just sat quietly to the right. Of Fan Xian's 4 disciples, the one who climbed the fastest was Qingjialan. He had already become the Suzhou Zhizhou. Now that he had been implicated by Fan Xian, he had also tragically fallen from power. The 2 great crimes the palace had given him of visiting prostitutes and invading the mausoleum were truly too severe. He was forcefully taken back to the capital. During this month, Fan Xian had rushed back and forth for him. He had exhausted a great deal of energy. Finally, he had saved his life, but he had also lost his position. It seemed that he had no future. Qingjialan sat below Yang Wanli listlessly, sighing and sighing. There were 2 tables in the flower hall. The women were all at the table behind the screen. Only Fan Xian and Yang Qing sat at the table outside. They did not move their chopsticks. They were waiting for someone. There were 2 tables in the flower hall. The women were all at the table behind the screen. Only Fan Xian and Yang Qing sat at the table outside. They did not move their chopsticks. They were waiting for someone. Outside the flower hall, snowflakes floated lightly in the Fan Manor's garden, waiting for the people who had returned. It was Shi Chanli who had left the Qin kingdom these years to carry out Fan Xian's will and unify the brothels under the sky. Shi Chanli entered the hall. He didn't even brush off the snow on his body before he first bowed deeply to Fan Xian in the main seat. He then bowed to his teacher's wife through the screen. Only then did he turn around. Looking at Yang Wanli and Qingjialan, he laughed bitterly and went forward to hug these 2 friends he hadn't seen in a long time. Presently, he and Sangwen were in charge of Baoyue brothel together, so he knew most of the news under heaven. He also knew of the tragic encounters these 2 friends had had in the past few months. Everything needed no words. Just a hug was enough to express the feelings of separation and comfort. "You're not feeling well, so don't get up." Shi Chanli very consciously sat below Qingjialan and spoke to Yang Wanli, who was about to get up and speak. Although he was now one of the wealthiest merchants in the world and could be considered a hero no matter where he was, the habits he had developed from wholeheartedly studying the books of sages had not changed. In particular, the regret in the depths of his heart made him naturally envious of the experiences of Yang Wanli, Qingjialan, and Hou Jichang. He also thought that as a merchant he should sit at the very bottom. Yang Wanli and Qingjialan met each other's eyes and smiled bitterly. They couldn't be bothered with this pedantic fellow. They turned their heads and chatted idly. No one talked about their tragic encounters these few months. No one went to criticize the court wantonly because they didn't want their teacher, Fan Xian, to worry about these things. After waiting for a while, no one came again. The expressions of the people at the table began to become awkward and ugly. Qing Jialin looked at Fan Xian's slightly focused expression and muttered, "Perhaps it's because the snow is heavy and they were delayed on the road." Yang Wanli pressed his lips tightly together and sighed. He picked up the wine cup in front of him and drained it in one gulp. Shi Chanli glanced at Fan Xian with confusion and said, "According to the news I received, Jichang should have returned to the capital 7 days ago. However, the court did not convict him and just let him be." Fan Xian raised his brows and smiled. "It is the end of the year. Many officials and colleagues have banquets and invitations. It is normal for them to not be able to come in time." Although he said this, he still couldn't help but feel gloomy. Ho Jichang had returned to the capital a few days ago, but he had not come to Fan Manor to visit. The spies in the court had also gotten wind of this. It seemed that the palace had no intention of punishing him. All of this already made it clear. In such a country, betraying one's teacher for glory was not unheard of. However, Fan Xian still did not feel good in his heart when it happened to him. His gaze slowly swept across the faces of the three people at the table. A complicated emotion rose in his heart. Shi Chanli was originally still in the Song Kingdom. This time he had taken the risk to come back to the capital to see him. There was no need to mention Yang Wanli. Fan Xian had always thought that Qing Jialin, who had already become the Suzhou Zhizhou, had a weak personality and was not very trustworthy. Unexpectedly, he would rather have his position taken away than betray him. Unexpectedly, Ho Jichang did not come. "I heard that Scholar He's Manor is also holding a banquet today." Shi Chanli's expression was a bit ugly. "Before you came to the capital, the two of them were known as the leading scholars of Jingdou and once had some personal friendship." Yang Wanli gritted his teeth and said in a dark and angry voice, "What a Jichang! He abandoned darkness for light quickly. When I see him another day, I must give him a good sigh of praise." These words were sarcasm. Qing Jialin could only smile bitterly. A moment later he sighed faintly and said, "Back in the Tongfu Inn, Jichang told me that even when Sir Fan Jr. was walking, he should not notice the rainwater on his umbrella dripping into the oil pan of the peddlers. Such a person who loved the people was the one we should follow. Who would have thought that he—" After a sigh, Fan Xian smiled. Calling for the three of them to start eating, he said, "Everyone has their own aspirations. Besides, I am unable to work in court. Jichang wants to work for the people. It is normal for him to be closer to Scholar He." His words were calm. No one could see the coldness in his heart. Fan Xian actually knew that of Fan Xian's 4 disciples, the one he had favored the most was Ho Jichang. However, the affairs of the world were strange. He didn't know if something had gone wrong with Fan Xian's arrangements or if it was a matter of luck. Of Fan Xian's 4 disciples, Yang Wanli had done a meritorious service in repairing the dikes. Qing Jialin had sat in the position of Suzhou Zhizhou at a young age. He was also one of the 7 gentlemen of the New Deal that the emperor had personally summoned into the palace. Although Shi Chanli had not entered officialdom, his identity as the owner of Baoyue brothel was glorious. Only Ho Jichang remained in Jiaozhou and was unable to fulfill the ambitions in his heart. Now that Fan Xian had lost all power, Sir Ho was probably dissatisfied and was forced to find other ways. It was not that Fan Xian did not understand this. He was just unhappy, particularly unhappy at Scholar He, who was also holding a banquet. After 3 rounds of wine, they chatted about the things they had done in their positions these years. Yang Wanli talked about how the shining white silver had become the huge rocks and earth on either side of the Yangtze River. Qing Jialin talked about how he had protected the border and people as Zhizhou, how he had used Sir Fan Jr.'s help to take care of the salt merchants and royal merchants, how he had helped his teacher's wife raise money to enter the Hangzhou conference, and how many poor commoners he had helped. Shi Chanli smiled as he talked about what he had seen and heard under heaven, as well as the slightly better lives of the miserable women in the brothels. He also told an interesting story. It was said that in the back of some Baoyue brothels, there was a statue of Sir Fan Jr. worshipping Sir Fan Jr. because he had protected the lives and safety of many girls. After these words were said, everyone other than Shi Chanli spat out their wine. Although the 3 of them were chatting about their own matters, they were all related to Fan Xian. They talked about some of the things Fan Xian had done in his life that were beneficial to the country and the people. Fan Xian was not a saint. He was only a mortal, so he was a bit happier. He smiled and looked at the 3 of them. After a moment he said, "Wanli has been living in the manor these days. In any case, he doesn't have a proper home in Jingdou. Jialin, your family is still in Suzhou, so you might as well move into the manor." Once their teacher spoke, the three of them fell silent at the same time. They put down the chopsticks in their hands and looked at him. I have made arrangements for the Suzhou family matters. Don't worry, Fan Xian looked at Qing Jialin and said warmly. Just get through this period of time. I called you here today because I was afraid that you would have resentment toward the court and me and harm yourselves. He laughed bitterly and said, of course, looking at it now, I don't need to worry about Jichang's side. But you know that I don't ask anything of you except for those 8 words. So even if the imperial court wants to find evidence of my crimes from you, it's impossible. Jichang has his own considerations, but I don't think he will betray me out of nothing. Fan Xian's expression calmed. He slowly said, the 4 of you followed me to be officials under heaven. That was a time of peace, so I needed your efforts. Presently the world is not at peace, so I needed you to endure silently. I know you want to help me, so I have privately gone to find some colleagues I am on good terms with. In the future, don't do this. My matters are not problems that the officials of the court can solve. Qing Jialin smiled bitterly and agreed. They all remembered clearly the 8 words Fan Xian had left them when they had been sent out. Be good people and be good officials. Since I can't be an official, then be an honest person. There was a hidden pain between Fan Xian's brows. The emperor had knocked everyone by his side into the dust. He had truly made him look left and right and was badly battered. This move was truly too vicious. After the family banquet, Yang Wanli and Qing Jialin went to the residence in the back garden to rest. Fan Xian left Shi Chanli behind. He had traveled thousands of miles to summon Shi Chanli back to the capital, not for something as simple as a meal. There were only the 2 of them left in the study. Shi Chanli no longer had to hide anything. He angrily cursed Ho Jichang. Fan Xian shook his head and said, in the end, Jichang is only a scholar and an official. Even though he has just learned to curry favor, how could he know that he has made a big mistake? Shi Chanli's heart chilled. He knew too many of his teacher's secrets. He knew that his teacher was not just a simple powerful official. His teacher's power was beyond his position of power. Ho Jichang's betrayal had, in reality, angered a ruler in the dark. Don't worry that I will kill him. I don't have the leisure to do that. Fan Xian lowered his eyelids slightly. How is the matter I had you investigate? There are no abnormalities in Dongyi or the north. There is no conflict with the flames of war on the surface, Shi Chanli added. He then replied seriously to Fan Xian's question. The matter of Gong Dian leaving the capital is indeed strange. The Bureau of Military Affairs sent a transfer order to Nanzhao 2 months ago. However, the level of secrecy is very high. The tower has only gotten wind of it. Without the cooperation of the council, a lot of the information can only be touched on the surface. Nanzhao? What's wrong there? Fan Xian furrowed his brows and asked. Commander Ye's son is on the front lines in Nanzhao. According to court practice, there is currently no fighting in Nanzhao. The new master has already succeeded the throne for 3 years. That border army should be halfway back to the capital to report. Shi Chanli glanced at him and continued. Based on the time, they should have already arrived in Jingdo to see the emperor and then returned to the various camps. However, that border army still has not arrived. You mean, they might have gone west? Fan Xian's heart jumped. He suddenly thought of a terrifying possibility. He shook his head and said, how could such a large movement of military power be hidden from everyone? If we had focused our attention on the south at the beginning, even if it was the southern front of Weizhou, with Wu Mei's help, perhaps we would have been able to find some movement, Shi Chanli said with self-blame. However, Baoyue Brothel has been paying attention to Jingdo, Dongyi, and northern Qi these few months. We haven't sorted through the intelligence reports there carefully enough. It has nothing to do with you. That's what I'm focusing on. Fan Xian rubbed his temples with a headache and said to himself, Yi Linger's brother, that bastard is not in Jingdo for a long time. I'd forgotten there was such a person. Based on the time, if the Nanzhao border army had truly turned back and passed Jingdo without entering, if they had truly gone west, wouldn't they have already reached Dingzhou? Fan Xian raised his head and took a deep breath. His eyes were filled with unease and tiredness. He knew he had made a big mistake. However, he had been under house arrest in Jingdo and the Overwatch Council was under Yan Bingyun's watch. It was indeed impossible to accurately grasp the movements of the Qing kingdom's military power just by relying on Baoyue Brothel. Gong Dian left the capital and went to Dingzhou to summon Crown Prince Hongqing back to the capital. He took with him 10,000 Jingdo garrison and 2,000 imperial soldiers, Shi Chanli reminded him. This is something that was discovered earlier. I know that. A feeling of defeat rose in Fan Xian's heart. His palm gently slapped the desk and sighed. I just did not think that the emperor would be so generous. He actually moved troops from the far south and crossed thousands of li. The army changed defenses. Is he not afraid that the world will fall into chaos? Hearing these words, Shi Chanli's body froze. He forced himself to calm down and analyze. For the court, the new Nanzhao ruler is young, and there are many powerful officials in the country who are inclined toward the Qing kingdom. There is no need to be on guard. It is enough to leave half of the army in the south. As for Yanjing and the northern camp situation in dealing with northern Qi and Dongyi, although it looks like it is because of the aftermath of the rebellion and the fact that the northern camp does not have a commander, in reality, there is no danger. Thus, for the emperor, as long as he can pacify Xiliang and there is no more cause for chaos, he can fully prepare for the northern expedition. To pacify Xiliang, we have to deal with the people on the grasslands. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and sighed gently. He knew that he had been completely calculated by the emperor. In the end, he had not escaped the emperor's grasp. An indescribable sense of tiredness and disappointment filled his body. It made him sit woodenly in the chair, unable to move. He finally knew why the emperor maintained such an indifferent attitude toward the battle in the north. He was not angry or wary at all because of the possible collusion between northern Qi and Fan Xian. The emperor had long sorted out the possible actions of his illegitimate child and had focused all of his attention and power on the west. The emperor did not dance with Fan Xian's plans. On the contrary, he took advantage of the situation and smashed his fist viciously toward Dingzhou. "We must immediately inform the crown prince," Shi Chanli said with a pale expression. Fan Xian sat tiredly in the chair. A moment later he said, "It's too late." A chill pervaded the grasslands in winter. The wind came from the north and passed through the North Sea, carrying with it some moisture. It had long been wiped clean in the barren deserts to the northeast of the grasslands. It was dry and cold. The autumn grass on the ground had long disappeared. What was left was only sand and frozen earth that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was so hard that even the hooves of the horses felt uncomfortable. If it had been a winter in the past, birds looking down from the sky might have been able to find some moving and alluring green beside some lakes. Today they couldn't even find these pitiful habitats. The eyes of these cold-resistant birds, who did not want to go to the south for the winter, were completely red. The frozen and dried grass was blood red. The round gravel was blood red. The sand that crumbled with a pinch was blood red. Even the bodies of the voles that crawled out of their caves seemed to be blood red. This was the mouth of Hong Mountain, a place one had to pass to enter the Qing territory from the grasslands. The mountain rocks were all red. However, the red today was not a strange color bestowed by the heavens. It was dyed red by the Hu people on the grasslands and the Qing soldiers. There were corpses and fresh blood everywhere. The earth-shaking battle cries that had startled the voles out of their caves and startled the birds into the sky had gradually stopped. However, cruel battles were still going on beside some barren hills. Some stubbornly resisting Hu tribe warriors had gathered into a few small circles. Under the siege of the Qing soldiers, who outnumbered them 10-1, they shed the last of their blood. A year ago, the Dingzhou general, King Jing's heir, Li Hongqing, had received the Black Knights and Fan Xian who had escaped from the grasslands at the mouth of Hong Mountain. At the time, he had hoped to be able to carry out a beautiful ambush here. However, the Hu people were not stupid. They never gave the Qing army such an opportunity. If it had been in the past, in such a cold season, the countless tribes of Shi who would have followed the banner of the king's tent and slowly avoided the cold air. They would have advanced deeper into the grasslands until they reached the foot of the mountain that could not be climbed. After they had endured the bitter cold of this year, they would once again cover the grasslands in the early spring of the second year. Shi who rarely chose to launch an attack on the Qing kingdom's Xiliang road in the middle of winter. In the past, other than tribes that had lost power in the fighting on the grasslands and would crazily try to cross the border to steal the winter rations of the Qing kingdom soldiers and civilians, there had never been a major military operation. This year was different. For some reason, Sir Hugo, who had inherited most of the left virtuous prince's cattle and sheep warriors, suddenly led his tribe to the east and bravely, or rather recklessly, launched an attack on Qing kingdom's territory. What confused the Shi Hu people even more was that the great chief, the far-sighted chief, expressed his approval of Hu Ji's actions after thinking for a day and night in the king's tent. He then braved the bitter cold to send out the most elite grasslands iron riders in an attempt to pass through the mouth of Hong Mountain, go around Qingzhou and directly attack the interior of Xiliang. No one would have thought that in the wilderness near the mouth of Hong Mountain, there would be 20,000 Qing iron riders and 70,000 Dingzhou soldiers lying in ambush. These Qing soldiers seemed to have long known the direction of the Hu people's attack on the grasslands. the number of people attacking, and the time of the attack. Most terrifyingly, they had predicted that she who would brave the bitter cold to attack this year. The Hu people's attack was completely unreasonable, and the Qing army's ambush was even more unreasonable. When these unreasonable things were put together, they created the great Qingzhou victory that would be recorded in the history books. This was a battlefield where tens of thousands of people sacrificed their lives. The side of a barren hill was already filled with corpses. Fresh blood flowed through the sand. This group of Hu tribe warriors had fought to the last man and were surrounded by the Qing army. From the earlier battle, the Qing military officer knew that this person was one of the few aces on the grasslands. Thus he stopped urging his subordinates forward. Instead, he slowly raised his right hand and coldly prepared to shoot. "Are you surrendering or not?" A cold voice echoed through the cold grasslands air. Hu Gu, covered in wounds, breathed heavily. His eyes were bloodshot as he glared at the Qing soldiers. Suddenly he let out a loud cry and stabbed his knife into his chest, so deep that the hilt disappeared. Hu Gu died, but his eyes were still open, looking hatefully at the sky. Even if he died, he would become a resentful spirit and ask the young man in Jingdo who had caused all of this without reason and bloodshed why. Why was all of this? Chapter 726. In the cold sky, an eagle was flying. It was not afraid of the arrows of the humans below. Fearlessly it glided down. Gliding across the battlefield that stretched for several li, it clearly saw the bodies of the Hu tribe soldiers who had died under the enemy's knives, spears, and crossbows. The fresh blood that gradually seeped into the sand and red earth, as well as the stimulating smell of iron and blood. The Qing army that had set up an ambush at the mouth of Hong Mountain began to clean up the battlefield and organize their formations. Even the most elite Dingzhou army had paid a heavy price in a great battle with the grassland's main force. The eagle flapped its wings and flew a little higher. Then it was alarmed to discover that a group of Qing light cavalry had silently attacked from the direction of the Shidahai meadow in the northeast. There were at least 4,000 people in this group. Following the natural rise and fall of the sand dunes and meadow, they silently advanced into the depths of the grasslands. A strange cry was heard as the goshawk seemed to have sensed the cavalry's killing intent and fearsome aura, so it flew higher into the cold clouds. After flying for an unknown period of time, it finally broke through the clouds and zoomed toward a small hill beside a lake. There were thousands of grassland Shihu soldiers on this small hill. Mixed among them were some northern warriors who had moved from the snowy plains in the north. However, this group of soldiers were clearly people who had escaped with great difficulty from the battle at the mouth of Hong Mountain earlier. Their morale was very low and many of them were already injured. Chief Su Bida's lips were dry, but there was no blood on his body. He looked coldly in the direction of the mouth of Hong Mountain in the distance. He knew that the Dingzhou army there was reorganizing and would not be able to rush over in a short amount of time. Presumably, the Qing people would not go deep into the grasslands in pursuit. He glanced at the warriors of the court around him. Seeing the injuries on their bodies, he thought of the great battle at the entrance of Hong Mountain. His eyes grew cold. Once the grasslands entered winter, they rarely used soldiers. This was something that Shihu and the Qing kingdom were already used to. The biggest reason was that the weather was cold and the ground was frozen. They had no supplies, so it was difficult for the Hu people to use their methods of coming and going like the wind and leaving like lightning. This winter, the chief had listened to Hu Ji's suggestion and gathered the most elite knights in his hands to begin an attack on Shilyang Road. It appeared to be an unwise choice, particularly with the wretched situation at hand. It seemed to further prove this point. But who was Chief Su Bida? 30 years ago, the Chanyu royal court, which was declining day by day, produced a person like him. He was able to survive and grow stronger in the cracks between the left and right virtuous princes, and he wisely accepted the barbarian cavaliers from the snow and ice in the north. He broadened his mind and absorbed the people from the central plains into his court. If it weren't for this era, if the eastern continent didn't have so many outstanding people, Chief Su Bida would have undoubtedly grown into a wise ruler of the grasslands, a figure whose might shook the world. How could he make such a low-level mistake? Su Bida's gaze pierced through the hill and landed on the Hu woman on the horse at the top of the hill. His expression became extremely complicated and downcast. Chief Su Bida had his own way of thinking as to why he had chosen to take the risk of attacking Shilyang Road in the cold of winter. He knew that the Qing court was currently in internal chaos. The emperor and his most favored officials were in a cold war. As for Hu Gu, the corners of the chief's eyes narrowed slightly. Like an eagle, he gazed in the direction of the distant Hong Mountain Pass. He thought to himself that Hu Gu, who dared to betray the grasslands and collude with the Overwatch Council, should already be dead. What a stupid person. How many of those who came into contact with the Overwatch Council could live smoothly? In this year, the chief Yu had already investigated what Hugu had relied on to rise up on the grasslands. Thus, he guessed why Hugu would choose such a winter to attack Shiliang Road. Chief Su Bida cared a great deal about the political rumors in Jingdo. With just a little calculation, he guessed that it must have something to do with Sir Fan Jr., who had lost power. The last time Fan Xian entered the grasslands, he had cleaned out most of the spies the grasslands had sent out. The power of the court had been severely damaged. In the end, Fan Xian had still managed to escape with a few hundred black knights right under the chief's nose. This reality made Su Bida feel endless humiliation. Particularly each time he looked at Songji Xianling, this humiliation was even harder to bear. This winter, Hu Ji's fake attack on Shiliang Road was an opportunity for the chief. After a long conversation with Songji Xianling, he rejected the princess' suggestion for him to be cautious. Instead, he wanted to use this opportunity to beat Fan Xian at his own game. Using the momentum of Fan Xian wanting to use foreign troops to help the position of the Dingzhou general, he gathered the power of the grasslands and attacked Shiliang decisively. This was a clever plan. Presumably, the Dingzhou general Li Hongqing had also received Fan Xian's news and thought that Hugu was faking an attack. He would not have expected the chief to take advantage of the situation and launch a large-scale attack, catching them off guard. Who would have thought that there would be more than 100,000 Qing elite soldiers gathered around the mouth of Hong Mountain? This was a most shameless ambush. After this battle, Hugu had been ambushed and killed. The court and the right virtuous prince's troops had suffered heavy casualties. At least 20,000 strong grassland soldiers had lost their lives on the Red Earth. Thinking of the pain of the battle earlier, the chief's eyes narrowed even more and his heart grew colder. He squeezed his horse's belly and came to Songji Xianling's side. In an icy voice, he said, "You said that he was only borrowing the grassland soldiers to help Li Hongqing stabilize his position." Haitang Duo did not turn around. The fur coat on her body shivered in the cold wind. As the chief, such a risky gamble should never have been made. I have never truly trusted him. However, I think this time has nothing to do with him. He is just a pitiful pawn that has been killed by someone else. The two of them fell silent at the same time. To be able to clearly calculate Fan Xian's response and the Hu people's strategy of beating them at their own game, and to have planned it long ago, resulting in a crushing defeat the grasslands had not experienced in 30 years, there could only be one person in the Qing kingdom with such great foresight and eyes on the world. In front of the Qing emperor, it seemed that all of the scheming were just the prelude to the killing move in his chess game. The eagle finally landed on Su Bida's cold outstretched arm. The sky was cold and the ground was frozen. After flying in the cold clouds for a while, the animal shivered in the cold. The color of the feathers on its body appeared particularly dim. Su Bida's pupils constricted. In a low voice he said, "There are thousands of light riders coming from the northeast." He said in a cold voice, "The Qing people are planning something big this time. I don't know which general dared to send another powerful army deep into the grasslands after this battle. In such cold weather, do these Qing people still have the extravagant hope of capturing the court in one fell swoop?" Although he said this, the chief was still shocked at the valiance of the Qing army and the determination they displayed to destroy everything. Although there were still thousands of grassland men around the lake, they had just experienced a great battle and were tired and low. If they were to face the 4,000 light riders who had been accumulating power for a long time in a head-on charge, victory or defeat would be obvious. Su Bida viciously cursed the Qing people for being despicable. They did not give him any chance to rest. As a king, he did not allow his angry emotions to destroy his reason. In the first instant, he had already sent out a warning to his subordinates at the bottom of the hill. Immediately, the court warriors around the lake immediately began to move. They moved quickly. It was impossible to see their earlier injuries and low moods. "Are you going with me?" The chief turned his horse's head and turned his head to glance at the Hu tribe woman on the hill. "I'm going to the Qing kingdom." Haitang Duo lowered her head slightly. Her eyes never left the mouth of Hong Mountain. Her expression was calm, but her voice revealed a glimmer of self-blame and self-reflection. She could see countless resentful spirits rising up in that direction. Because of Hu Ji's trust in a certain person, her trust in a certain person, and the chief's trust in her, tens of thousands of soldiers on the grasslands had been surrounded by the Qing Iron Riders. There were heavy casualties. Broken limbs and heads littered the ground like dead wood in a rotting swamp. This hellish scene on the battlefield made even her heart waver involuntarily. Only in that moment did the present leader of Tianidao realize that, among thousands of soldiers and horses, one person's power was actually very small and could not change anything. I want an explanation. If I can't, I have to give you, as well as these people who died, an explanation. After Haitang finished speaking, she gently squeezed her horse's belly and turned into a streak of light smoke. Riding down the hill, she headed in the opposite direction of the sun. The words Fan Xian had asked Hong Yiqing to bring to her had already been delivered. Because of the matter between Shiliang and the grasslands, Haitang could not leave at the moment. At this moment she had to go to Jingdo. Chief Su Bida didn't turn his head to look at the streak of dust again. With a stern cry, he led his remaining soldiers and advanced deeper into the grasslands. He believed that as long as he returned to his true home, the Qing light riders leaping at him like wolf cubs would no longer be a threat to him. In the west of the grasslands, of the 10,000 northern man-iron riders who only obeyed Songji Xianling, 7,000 were still alive and waiting for him. Compared to the strange battle in the north of the mainland, the battle in Shiliang Road between the Qing kingdom and the Hu people was, without a doubt, more far-reaching and important in history. The beginning of this battle was actually a series of orders Fan Xian had the Qinian unit send out in a small courtyard in Jingdo that had been bought for over 100 liang of silver. It was because of these orders that Hu Gu led the left virtuous prince's old subordinates and pretended to launch an attack against Shiliang Road. Chief Su Bida's hawk-like eyes saw the relationship between Hu Gu and the Overwatch Council's Fan Xian and took advantage of the situation to act. Unexpectedly, all of this was within the Dingzhou military's expectations. The large net at the mouth of Hong Mountain had reaped countless Hu lives. After this battle, the left virtuous prince's troops were completely wiped out. The court and right virtuous prince's troops suffered heavy losses and lost all their prestige. The various tribes on the grasslands began to grow restless. Chief Su Bida's budding ambition to establish a country with the help of northern Qi's Tianyi Dao, Songji Xianling, was shattered. For decades the grasslands would be in chaos. There would be no opportunity for unification. The great defeat of Shi Hu in this battle had far-reaching effects. History called it the Qingzhou Great Victory. Other than the battle at the mouth of Hong Mountain, there was another important reason for the endless unrest on the grasslands. It was the 4,000 light riders that had been discovered by the Eagle. A young general had planned the entire battle of the Dingzhou army ambushing the elite Shi Hu troops. Furthermore, this general had abruptly left the battlefield at the mouth of Hong Mountain the moment the battle began. As the commander, he led the 4,000 light riders hidden in the east and launched a continuous half-year chase toward the remaining soldiers of the court. This chase was carried out in the ice and snow and galloped across the wasteland. Regardless of whether it was the pursuers or the deserters, they all lived unusually cruel lives. In the end, this chase had beaten Chief Su Bida until he lost all of his courage. No matter what, he was unable to make contact with the 7,000 northern man-iron riders scattered in the far west. Passing through winter, spring, wind, snow and long grass, this jaw-dropping chase continued for 5 months. When the last remaining strength of the chief's court finally made contact with the last 7,000 iron riders Haitang Duo had left on the grasslands, the brave and heroic Qing light riders finally withdrew from the grasslands. In the 5 months on the grasslands, this group of only 4,000 light riders burned, killed and plundered along the way. They destroyed countless Hu tribes. Using iron-blooded methods and discipline, they maintained a difficult chase through the grasslands. By the time they returned to Qingzhou in the spring of the second year, there were only 800 of the 4,000 left. The commander of this group of iron riders that had completely changed the situation in the west of the Qing kingdom and completely dispelled any thoughts of Shi Hu invading the central plains was actually the commander of the Qingzhou victory. As a high-ranking general who should have been in the tent giving orders, he had bravely lowered his rank and entered the grasslands in pursuit. Other than the Qing emperor's meticulous planning, this young general was the truly powerful figure in the Qingzhou victory. Chief Su Bida's defeat at his hands was not undeserved at all. This young general was called Yi Wan. He was the eldest son of Commander Yi Zhong, head of the Bureau of Military Affairs in the Qing kingdom, and the brother of second Wangfei Yi Ling. He was the person who had left the Dingzhou army at the age of 17 and gone to the front lines in Nanzhou. While Yi Wan was holding down the fort in Qingzhou and commanding the deployment of the battle at the mouth of Hong Mountain, killing the Hu people until they cried out for heaven and earth, the highest military commander in Shiliang Road in name, General Li Hongqing, was under house arrest in the general's manor in Dingzhou. Also in the manor with him was Gong Dian, who had left his position as commander of the imperial army and had come to Dingzhou to take over. Military reports from Qingzhou flowed endlessly into the general's manor. Gong Dian and Li Hongqing sat on two sides, silently looking at the military reports and not saying a word. The troops entering battle near Qingzhou were basically the headquarters of the Dingzhou army in Shiliang Road. They were all border soldiers born and raised there. The Yi family had operated here for decades. Other than the Great Prince's expedition to the west, where he was still able to leave some influence, the Yi family was like the emperor of the Dingzhou army. Presently, the emperor had moved the eldest son of the Yi family back to Dingzhou to lead these old Dingzhou soldiers in a ferocious attack. Of course, there was no problem in cooperating. The half of the Nanzhao border army that made Fan Xian's heart tremble did not actually surge into Dingzhou as he had imagined. Instead, it stopped in the north of the Tsang Mountains to the west of Jingdou. Then, it chose one of them to enter Dingzhou. There were not many of them, but it was enough to control the general's manner. The handover of military power in Dingzhou was not actually a handover of soldiers. It was just a handover of generals. The eldest son of the Yi manor entered Dingzhou. With the cooperation of the imperial army and other powers led by Gong Dian, he easily took military power from Li Hongqing's hands. If everything had gone according to Fan Xian's plan, if there had not suddenly been a young general, Yi Wan, who used soldiers like a god and the Dingzhou army saw as their own, then when Hu Ge led his people to attack, Li Hongqing could have taken the opportunity to keep him in office for another year and a half. It was very quiet in the general's manor. After a long silence, Li Hongqing calmly said, "When it comes to marching and fighting, I am not as good as Yi Wan." Gong Dian raised his head and glanced at him. A moment later he replied in a raspy voice, "Yi Wan grew up in the Dingzhou army. From the age of 3, he had practiced martial arts on horseback and controlled battle formations. However, he was impetuous in his youth. He resented his father forcefully suppressing his achievements, so he abandoned Dingzhou and joined Nanzhao. No wonder there is so little news of this person in the capital." Li Hongqing nodded. Gong Dian sighed and said, "Back then, Commander Yi suppressed his achievements because he was too young and had too much military service. He was afraid it would arouse fear. After all, the old Qin master's eldest son had died a violent death in the camp. Qin Hung was also not as good as him." Li Hongqing looked at the military report in front of him and shook his head. Commander Yi is well aware of the art of blending with the light. No wonder he was able to hide such an outstanding son for so long. The Dingzhou army's wish in this life is to pacify Shi Hu. Gong Dian was also a general from the Dingzhou army. He gazed at Li Hongqing and said, "It is only right and proper to be loyal to the emperor. Regardless of what the world thinks of the Dingzhou army for the benefit of the emperor and the Qin kingdom, we are willing to do anything." Li Hongqing laughed bitterly. He knew these words were referring to Yi Ling'er's marriage to the second prince. In the end, the Dingzhou army had changed sides during the Jingdou rebellion, giving the second prince the heaviest blow. "I don't know what Fan Xian has said to you in private, but if this time he let in the enemy to invade just to protect your position as general." Gong Dian's eyes narrowed. Coldness surged. "I find Fan Xian's actions shameful." Li Hongqing raised his face and gazed calmly at Gong Dian. "Who do you think I am? Who is Fan Xian? Since I dared to have Hu Ge come, I have my ways. Even if Yi Wan hadn't come, do you think I would have let the Hu people take advantage of me? In the end, it is something that hasn't happened. There is still room to turn around," Gong Dian said. "I think the emperor must be extremely disappointed in Sir Fan Jr." He paused and then continued, "After the crown prince returns to Jingdou, please help me take a message to Sir Fan Jr. I have always admired him, but this time I am somewhat disappointed. A man is born between heaven and earth. How can he use the blood of soldiers as a bargaining chip?" Li Hongqing took a deep breath and gazed at Gong Dian with a not-quite-there smile. After a moment of silence he calmly said, "In the end, you still don't understand Fan Xian. If he was truly a person who built his success on tens of thousands of bones, if he truly did not care about the lives of Qing soldiers, then the Qing kingdom would probably have long become a tattered shirt riddled with holes. No matter how great and astute the emperor is, how could he stop him from ripping apart the shirt from the inside? You underestimate his ability. You also underestimate his character." Gong Dian was silent, but there was a faint chill in his heart. He didn't know that in front of the emperor, Sir Fan Jr. had already suffered a great injury. Could he still have the power to retaliate? Although the battle at the mouth of Hong Mountain was an ambush, they had faced tens of thousands of grasslands riders who were like wolves and tigers. The Qing court, or more accurately the Qing emperor, had put a great deal of effort into this. One secret edict removed Li Hongqing's military power. Another secret edict gave the eldest son of the Yi manor, Yi Wan, full authority to command. As the saying goes, don't doubt the people you use and don't use the people you doubt. The emperor's confidence, or gamble, in that young general ultimately won a complete victory. Victory required a foundation and soldiers. In order to defeat the Hu people on the grasslands, all of the soldiers in the military camps inside and outside Dingzhou had been moved out. The entire Dingzhou army had gone out. Adding on the Qingzhou army, only then did they obtain such a result. Presently in Dingzhou, the group of soldiers Gong Dian had personally brought, as well as a small portion of the Nanzhao border soldiers Yi Wan had left behind, maintained order and peace. Li Hongqing silently returned to his manor and stared at the large map in a daze in his study. He then said to the guest who had been accompanying him the entire time, "I am about to return to Jingdou. I will send you out of Dingzhou. As for how you will escape in the future, that will depend on your ability." The guest was silent for a moment and then said, "I thank you on your behalf for your great kindness." This person was Fan Xian's trusted aide, Deng Ziyu. He was fully responsible for the matter of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council stationed in Xiliang. After the upheaval in Jingdou, Deng Ziyu had become a figure the court had to capture. No one had thought that he would be so daring as to hide in the general's manor. In the Qingzhou victory, other than the emperor's bright eyes and General Ye's godly use of troops, the Overwatch Council was also fully mobilized. Yan Bingyun has been in Dingzhou the entire time. Presumably Jingdou doesn't know. Deng Ziyu sighed and then said, "Sir Fan Jr.'s plans have all fallen into the emperor's calculations. Now that things have come to a head, I cannot betray the interests of the Qing kingdom and go inform those Hu people. I trust that Sir Fan Jr. and I also have the same thoughts." Li Hongqing was silent for a moment and then said, "I suddenly feel that Gong Dian's words are reasonable. No matter what Fan Xian does in the end, he is not the emperor's match. He is also unwilling to let the Qing people sink into a wretched situation. Since it is so, why bother?" Chapter 727. In the winter of the 10th year of the Qing calendar, General Li Hongqing had won a great victory in Qingzhou. He had been summoned back to the capital. At the age of 30, he became the deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs with incomparable glory. However, the people who sang praises of the great Qing kingdom in Jingdou could clearly see that the position of the deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs was actually just an idle position. Under Yi Zhong's suppression, it was impossible for the heir, Li Hongqing, to be like he was in Dingzhou and have completely his own martial power. No one forgot that the previous person to ascend to the lofty position of the deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs at such a young age was Qin Heng. That person's fate was not very glorious. After Li Hongqing returned to the capital, he immediately entered the royal palace to see the emperor. In the royal study, the emperor did not vent a glimmer of anger toward him. Instead, he only calmly talked about the scenery of Xiliang. However, the crown prince looked at Fan Ruoruo beside the emperor. His mood sank to the bottom. Leaving the royal palace, Li Hongqing went to the Bureau of Military Affairs to hand over his mission and set a date for his return. Li Hongqing returned to the manor and saw King Jing, who had just been released after being under house arrest in the royal palace, as well as his weak and pitiful sister. The family of 3 sat together in silence. The old prince sighed repeatedly and patted Li Hongqing's shoulder. "Fortunately, nothing went wrong. You were able to last until today before returning to Jingdou. This can be considered giving the other side an explanation." Although he said this, Li Hongqing still personally went to the Fan Manor that night. He knew how high Fan Xian's hopes for him were. Although he had stubbornly resisted the emperor's edict and Gong Dian's pressure in Dingzhou and managed to drag it out for a few more days, in the end, he was still summoned back wretchedly. He had to personally give Fan Xian an explanation. No one knew the conversation between this pair of friends in the study in the back garden of the Fan Manor. Presumably, they were just expressing their apologies to each other. The palace did not seem to be very interested in this conversation because no one stopped Li Hongqing from entering the manor. "I also didn't think things would develop like this." Fan Xian laughed bitterly. Standing, he hugged him and gently patted his back before seeing him out of the study. Before Li Hongqing left the study, he turned around and glanced at him worriedly. "Deng Zi, you should have escaped, but I'm afraid quite a few of your Qinian unit died on Xiliang Road. After all, this is a matter of your institute. I don't know the inside story. I hope you can control your emotions. I don't know who the traitor is. Perhaps it was just one of the 3 meetings and the people in the council found out. After all, this time Yan Bingyun is personally holding the fort. Facing this person, I don't have much confidence." Fan Xian's expression was a bit gloomy. "But relax. I've never been too interested in things like revenge. I just feel a bit panicked. If even you feel flustered, then I advise you to behave yourself for the time being. Li Hongqing shook his head and refused Fan Xian's intention to see him out of the manor. Like a father comforting him, he patted his shoulder forcefully, lifted his clothes and walked out of the manor. Watching Li Hongqing's slightly lonely figure disappear from the winter garden, Fan Xian was silent for a long time before he turned his head and sat back down in the grand wooden chair in the study. Earlier, Hongqing had relayed Gong Dian's evaluation of him. That evaluation made Fan Xian involuntarily feel a touch of bitterness in his mouth. If one truly looked into it, Fan Xian's arrangements in Dongyi and Xiliang did indeed have this intention. Without a doubt, this intention could not stand on a moral level. A man should be happy with gratitude and enmity. How could he use the blood and lives of soldiers as a bargaining chip? No one could truly understand what Fan Xian was thinking. He did not want too many innocent people in the world to lose their lives because of his battle with the emperor. That was why he had chosen this arrangement. The Qingzhou victory was a perfect manifestation of the emperor's deep planning and foresight. Regardless of whether it was Hu Ji's feint attack or the chief's reaction, all of this was a foundation that the Overwatch Council, or rather Fan Xian, had spent a great deal of energy to lay down. This foundation had been ruthlessly and calmly used by the emperor. Fan Xian did not feel any closeness to the Hu people on the grasslands. The corpses on the fields in Xiliang Road and the burned houses would only make him clap his hands in praise of the Qingzhou victory. The problem was, this victory had easily destroyed all of Fan Xian's arrangements in Xiliang Road. If Li Hongqing still wanted to delay and not return to the capital under these circumstances, it was the same as seeking death. Fan Xian felt a deep chill and admiration for the emperor's methods and abilities. A cowardly thought that was difficult to resist grew in his heart. You heard it all. This matter has nothing to do with me. Fan Xian pressed his hands against the desk and closed his eyes tiredly. Having returned to the central plain, Haitang Duo, who had once again put on the flowery jacket, appeared behind him. After the battle at the entrance of Hong Mountain, she had moved out at about the same time as the group in Dingzhou. Li Hongqing had returned to the capital quickly, but he was still a day later than her. Presently, the palace's surveillance of the Fan Manor had relaxed a great deal. How could they stop the northern Qi sage girl from quietly entering the manor? It had already been a year since they had seen each other. Haitang looked silently at the young man in the grand wooden armchair, thinking to herself, actually, the other person's age isn't that old, but why does he look so old and heavy now? There's a trace of exhaustion on his face that can't be brushed away. Thinking of what had happened in the Qing kingdom these days and the dead director of the Overwatch Council, Haitang suddenly understood why Fan Xian appeared so tired. Because of the words you had Hong Yiqing bring to me, many people died on the grasslands, Haitang said. Fan Xian opened his eyes and laughed coldly. I only had the court agree to Hu Gu sending out troops. I had not thought that the chief would take advantage of the opportunity. Haitang did not explain to him that she had once tried to suppress Su Bida's ambitions. Lightly she said, in the end it was still the Qing kingdom who took advantage. Fan Xian was silent. A moment later he said, you don't need to worry about how the news got out. I sent 2 people to Xiliang Road. Hong Yiqing has still not been able to gather the people from the 4th Bureau. It is clear that Ziyu was being watched by the council during the handover. Speaking of this, he took a deep breath and suddenly thought of the young general of the Yi family mentioned in the intelligence reports. It was said that the young general had led 4,000 light riders into the grasslands to chase after the remnants of the chief's court. Fan Xian couldn't help but admire this person's courage. Thinking of the cold of winter and the fact that they were deep in the grasslands, he was afraid that these 4,000 riders would never come back alive. Those barbarians who moved from the north to the grasslands, do they still listen to your orders? He raised his head to glance at Haitang. You are, after all, the princess of the snowy plains. You are also respected by the chief on the grasslands and have a high status. Presumably you have some power. Haitang furrowed her brows slightly. A glimmer of anger flashed through her eyes as bright as the North Sea. Coldly she said, at this time, you are still worried about the life and death of the 4,000 light riders? No wonder you are a powerful official of the Qing kingdom. Why don't you think of the tribes on the grasslands that have lost all of their young men and have no power to resist? I am a Qing person, then a Central Plain person, and finally a human, Fan Xian replied with his head lowered. Just as you say, Su Bida's ambitions were too great this time. He took away large numbers of young men from the various tribes. The grasslands are already empty of power. After the Qingzhou battle, the 4,000 light riders killed their way into the grasslands. As long as the snowy plains man riders left in the west of the grasslands maintain their distance, they may actually come back. She who is finished. If the time is right, the tribes you moved from the north to the grasslands may be able to take advantage of the situation and rise. Fan Xian lightly tempted Haitang. Fan Xian lightly tempted her. You must accept this reality and then make use of it. I'm not like you. There are many things that I know are beneficial but do not conform to the principles in my heart, so I am unable to do them. Haitang lowered her eyelids slightly and replied in a quiet voice. However, your words right now truly surprise me. You are clearly a ruthless person who holds yourself in high regard and does not prioritize the interests of the Qing kingdom. Why do you have such a request? If I truly did not consider the interests of the Qing kingdom or even the entire world, why would I still be suffering in this manner? Regardless of whether it was to throw away hot blood or to hide from the world, I would have done it a long time ago. When did you become a saint? I am not a saint. It is just that at a certain stage in life, when the highest level of desire for power has been satisfied, I will place more emphasis on spiritual considerations. Furthermore, I do not like to be seen by others as a cold-blooded and heartless scum who only knows how to use the blood of soldiers. In the end, you are still a hypocritical and selfish person, Haitang said as she looked at him. She then placed the little knife in front of him. Fan Xian replied expressionlessly, if this counts as hypocrisy and selfishness, I think all the people in the world would thank me for being a vain person. I know your emperor is a woman, so consider it as me blackmailing you. Haitang's body shook slightly. She looked at him and didn't speak for a long time. The entire study was immersed in an oppressive atmosphere. After a long time, he opened his mouth and said with some difficulty, actually, there are many times when I need someone to help and give advice. Originally it was Yan Bingyun and Wang Qinian who played this role. Now Yan Bingyun has become his pure official. I have arranged for Lao Wang to leave. I have no one to ask. I'm not an immortal. Facing him, I have no confidence at all. With no one to help me, I am truly helpless. Are you acting pitiful in front of me? Haitang said sarcastically but was slightly startled. She sighed and said, what do you want to ask? He then drank a mouthful of cold tea to moisten his throat. He stuck out his tongue and licked his lips. With a serious expression, he said, my sister is in the royal palace, my entire family is in Jingdo, and the loyal subordinates who rely on me and believe in me are in the shadow of this country. I have power, but it is difficult to shake the foundation of this court. I also don't want to shake this foundation and let the moths, ants, and rabbits basking in the sun fall to their deaths. My opponent has great power, cold rationality, and extraordinary planning ability. He has the loyalty of the vast majority of people in this land. Most importantly, although I know from the news that came out of the palace after the rain in early autumn that he gradually came down from the altar and began to become like a mortal, leaving behind some emotional emptiness, I still believe that his blood is cold enough and his heart is strong enough. Once I truly act, the people I want to protect will truly no longer exist. In the past, I was very afraid of death. Now I'm not so afraid of death. Fan Xian said a long speech and then continued to seriously conclude. But I am very afraid that the people I love and protect will die. Can you help me resolve this problem? Haitang was not silent for long. Very straightforwardly she said, I cannot. Fan Xian spread out his hands and let out a long sigh. Look, there is no one in this world who can help me resolve this problem. What do you mean by him coming down from the altar? Haitang was clearly very interested in this matter. She didn't know where Fan Xian's judgment of the Qing emperor came from. Fan Xian gently placed his right hand on the position of his heart and said with a not quite there smile, after all, the heart of a father and son is connected. You can't sense some small changes, but I can. He had me stay in the manner to do these things and then break them one by one for me to see. Although he demonstrated the power of an emperor, don't you think this is actually very troublesome? He had too many ways to make all of this disappear without a trace. However, he didn't do this. He was angry with me, angry with Qin Pingping, and angry with my mother. A person who originally had no meridians and was heartless has now learned to be angry. Don't you think he is becoming more and more like a normal person? Fan Xian shook his head and smiled bitterly. Presumably, this is also the result the old cripple wanted to cause when he went to die. But you still have no way to change this trend. Haitang sat in the chair and lowered her head slightly. You've been sitting in Jingdo for a few months but have thrown the cause of chaos everywhere under heaven. Your thinking is actually very simple. She raised her head and stared at Fan Xian's bloodshot eyes with her bright eyes. Heavily she said, presumably this is also part of Qin Pingping's plan for revenge. First, he shakes the world, takes advantage of the chaos to force the emperor to abdicate, and then strikes like lightning. However, you have not obtained the Qing Emperor's trust as he imagined. This is your pitiful vanity causing mischief. At the same time, you also have no way to act viciously against the world. This is your pitiful hypocrisy causing mischief. You should understand that although your personality appears sinister, in reality, in the end, you are not an ambitious and ruthless person. There are many things you cannot do. Haitang blinked slightly and put away the frightening cold light in her eyes. Calmly she said, "Since it is so, there is no other word that can describe what you are doing now other than naive and childish. In the end, you still do not have the confidence to face him head-on." Fan Xian was silent for a moment and said, "Who would have this confidence? During these few months I was only backing him and trying to warn him. Thus, I maintained a situation that could collapse at any moment and did my best to protect the people by my side. If it wasn't for the Emperor remembering that I didn't give up and throw half of the Qing kingdom into chaos, do you think Yang Wanli, Qing Jialin, and the people in the First Bureau would have survived?" He raised his head and stared at Haitang. "I had to prove my strength to be able to protect these people's lives. Correct, at the final juncture, I still had to compete with the Emperor face to face. I did not have that confidence, so I have been waiting for someone to come back." "The blind great master." Haitang did not ask. Instead, she straightforwardly said this name that seemed to have a magical power. "You cannot always place your hopes on the elders who once supported you as you grew up. Regardless of whether it is your mother, Qin Pingping, or Minister Fan, they have already done too much for you." Haitang looked at Fan Xian. A glimmer of pity suddenly rose in her heart. "Have you ever thought that if the blind great master never comes back, what is the point of you tormenting yourself in Jingdo?" Haitang advised Fan Xian with a serious expression. "There are many things you have to do yourself. Regardless of whether you have this confidence or not, the situation has already forced you to this step. Since you cannot be indifferent to your mother and Qin Pingping's deaths, then you will never be able to play his good official and son again." Fan Xian suddenly felt these words were very piercing to the ear. He furrowed his brows and raised his hand to stop Haitang from speaking. In a low voice he said, "You have never personally experienced his power, so you can easily say the word confidence." Haitang sighed and said, "But how much longer can you wait?" He did not even think about the commotion you and the Emperor made in Sangzhou. Instead, he directly led his troops to the west and easily wiped out all of the hidden dangers there. Next would be Jiangnan and then Dongyi. No, perhaps he wouldn't even care about Dongyi and would directly head north. Once the situation develops to that point, all of your power will have been completely uprooted. Other than hold up in Jingdo like an idle person, watching him walk step by step toward the peak, and watching him laugh coldly at the souls of your elders, what else can you do? He can't touch Jiangnan. If he touches that place, I will have to move. Once I move, the entire Qing kingdom, including him, will feel pain. I don't know what you did in the palace treasury, but I believe that a figure like the Qing Emperor would not care about any losses for the sake of the obsession in his heart," Haitang said. At this moment, a voice rang out from the shadows of the study. It was icy to the extreme. "The Emperor, that bastard, was never human. How could he know the feeling of pain?" The person who spoke was the shadow that had floated in Jingdo like a shadow these few months. Immediately after, another direct and steady voice rang out as if it also wanted to convince Fan Xian. "I don't understand much about things like self-confidence. If I really have to draw my sword, I will tell myself that I have to be confident." The person who spoke was 13th Wang, this staunch last disciple of the Sword Hut. Even when faced with the unfathomable great grandmaster, the Qing Emperor, he remained calm and stubborn. Just as Fan Xian had analyzed before, the Emperor's, or rather, the Qing kingdom's, greatest weakness was the lack of top-notch individual martial power. Those once powerful figures had all died one by one in the Qing kingdom's internal strife. More than half of the 9th-level aces stood in Fan Xian's camp. Even the Qing Emperor did not dare to underestimate such power. If Eunuch Hong, the Qing father and son, Yan Xiaoyi, and other aces were still alive, then the Qing kingdom could truly be said to be a military camp forged from iron. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He didn't directly reply to the persuasion of the 3 top aces in the study. Instead, he furrowed his brows and said, "I don't want you all to die to his hands. Furthermore, this is, in the end, my business." In the deep winter of the 10th year of the Qing calendar, Fan Xian was like a wild beast trapped in a snowstorm. He was anxious, gloomy, and uneasy. He watched helplessly as the powerful emperor used schemes and foresight that far surpassed his own to slice off his left and right arms one by one. He watched helplessly as the Qing court methodically marched toward the achievement of unifying the land, yet he was unable to do anything. In front of the Qing Emperor, Fan Xian, who had always been good at hiding himself, finally lost his confidence for the first time. He didn't know how to defeat such a powerful figure. Thus he was waiting. He didn't know if the person he was waiting for would return. In order to ensure the safety of himself and those beside him while he waited, he was doing his best to do something. Jingdo was unexpectedly calm. According to the intelligence Baoyue brothel had painstakingly obtained, Fan Wujiu of Scholar He's Manor, once the second prince's strategist, had been injured in a surprise attack and had since disappeared. However, He Zongwei had not been implicated in this matter. Fan Xian felt slightly disappointed. He finally understood that the scholar, that old fox, was not so easy to use. What made Fan Xian feel even more defeated was that news finally came from Jiangnan. It was not good news. The transmission of information in this era was always slow, so slow that it made one angry. The news Fan Xian received in December was, in reality, something from a month ago. The Palace Treasury Transport Company had received a secret edict from the palace. According to the plan, they had begun the preparations for the opening of the treasury bidding next spring. However, this year the bidding process of the palace treasury had undergone a shocking change. It had changed the bidding of preparing silver to the bidding of the court's evaluation report. This change directly changed the palace treasury's authority to invite merchants from the court and the merchants to completely become the court's arrangement. In other words, when the palace treasury bidding opened next year, whoever the court wanted to win the bid would win. Thus, even if the Ming family led by Xia Qifei had the secret support of Zhaoshang Money House and Taiping Money House, they might not be able to continue their past glory. This was, without question, a heavy blow to Fan Xian's power. The rules of the palace treasury bidding had been fixed ever since the 3 large workshops were built. Regardless of whether it was the old Yi family or the later palace treasury, no one dared to lightly change this rule. The change this winter was, without question, a humiliating setback. Everyone knew that the emperor's edict would have an inestimable adverse effect on all of Jiangnan's commercial activities. Unexpectedly, the Jiangnan merchants did not band together to resist this muddle-headed edict. On the contrary, the Lingnan Xiong family and Chuanzhou Sun family maintained their silence. A few salt merchants began to itch to try. As everyone knew, a number of the disciples of those salt merchants had died to Sir Fan Jr.'s hands during the spring examinations. Chapter 728. It was not easy to live in Jiangnan. How deep was the snow in Jiangnan? The repeated secret edicts of the Qing court threw all of Jiangnan into chaos. The snow, which was not heavy, added an endless chill to the tens of thousands of common people. All of the large merchants felt the pressure and murderous aura coming from Jingdo. The Xiong family of Lingnan and the Sun family of Chuanzhou had always been on good terms with the Fan family. Under the pressure of the court, they did not dare move. As for the salt merchants who had always been under the protection of the court nobility and had been stealing the wealth of the world from the side, they began to grow restless. The change in the way the palace treasury invited business had fundamentally attacked the power Fan Xian possessed. Everyone could see this clearly, particularly Xia Qifei as Fan Xian's representative in Jiangnan and the current head of the Ming family. He felt the imminent danger. Given the Ming family's influence in Jiangnan and, most importantly, the survival of the Ming family would affect the lives of the people in Jiangnan. It would make the court have some fear when they acted. At least, they would not directly force the Ming family to death in the 11th year of the Qing calendar. If the Ming family truly fell apart, the court would not receive any benefits. However, this trend was already set. If the situation continued to develop like this, in a few years, the Ming family would gradually be marginalized and gradually swallowed up by the other dozen or so Jiangnan merchants supported by the court. Behind Xia Qifei were the lives of tens of thousands of people. He had no choice but to be cautious and prudent. Furthermore, the long conversation that night with the Jiangnan governor, Shui Qin, made it clear what the court wanted of him. After that night, Xia Qifei sank into deep thought. He had to choose between Sir Fan Jr. and the court. It was because of this vexing thought that after he received the Qinian unit's notice, he did not choose to immediately sneak into Jingdo to meet with Fan Xian. It was not that he had begun to waver. Rather, he knew that Fan Xian had asked him to enter the capital to assess his loyalty. The present situation did not give Xia Qifei the time to demonstrate his loyalty. The situation in Jiangnan was too dangerous, so he only wrote a personally written letter to Fan Xian to express his loyalty as always. If it had been any other merchant, it would not have been a difficult matter to choose between the court and the already powerless Fan Xian. Merchants pursued profit. They themselves did not have the true power to influence the situation. They had to voluntarily or be forced to lean toward the more powerful side. This was the natural nature of merchants. Even if Xia Qifei abandoned Fan Xian and left, presumably, it would not be surprising or shameful to many people. However, Xia Qifei was not a normal merchant. This was also the reason Fan Xian had chosen him to be his representative in Jiangnan. This illegitimate child of the Ming family had a very similar life path to Fan Xian. He had wandered the Jianghu since he was young and was the leader of the Jiangnan water bandits. Other than the natural bloodline of a merchant, he also had some of the spirit of loyalty of the Jianghu people. Xia Qifei knew that without Sir Fan he would not be able to return. Was Fan Jr. would not be able to Fan. Of the Ming, of Ming he returned he, and Ming he Fan he and he. The Ming family had operated in Jiangnan for countless years. Even when Fan Xian had come to Jiangnan in the past, it had been difficult. Now, under Xia Qifei's lead, they began to launch a resistance against the pressure of the Jiangnan governor's yamen and the secret edict from Jingdo. For a moment, all of Jiangnan fell into chaos. The Jiangnan governor, Xue Qing, who had worked well with Fan Xian in the past but did not show much of himself, stood up. This high-ranking border official in the Qing court coldly began to suppress the Ming family. Furthermore, he, unexpectedly, once again helped the fourth master of the Ming family onto the stage. This was a move Fan Xian had used in the past. Now Xue Qing simply copied it and obtained very good results. The Ming garden had always been divided into a few factions. Although the old Ming family did not have a lot of shares in their hands, they were, after all, people within the Ming family. Now that the differences between the two sides had been put on the table, it was clearly difficult for Xia Qifei to continue protecting Fan Xian's interests in Jiangnan. However, Xia Qifei still persisted. With the great support of Zhaoshang Money House, he turned money into power and permeated the entire Jiangnan officialdom from bottom to top. He did not care about the true implementation of the court's edict. The head of the Ming family knew that the general trend could not be stopped. Sir Fan Jr. was just waiting for something in Jingdo. What they needed to do was to do their best to preserve his power and allow his wait in Jingdo to continue. The problem was, how long would they have to wait? How long would they have to endure with their lives on the line before they reached the end? They did not endure for long. It was clear that the Qing court had lost patience with the Jiangnan aristocrats and merchants' lack of cooperation. On the third day after the end of Winter Tea Party the Palace Treasury Transport Company held, the head of the Ming family, Xia Qifei, who had sternly opposed the new rules of the Palace Treasury bidding, was assassinated outside Suzhou. There were more than 500 black-clothed people assassinating Xia Qifei. No one knew how these killers had passed through the Qing kingdom's strict internal defenses and arrived outside Suzhou. They also didn't know where these ruthless and military-like killers had come from. Why had the Suzhou government and the Jiangnan governor's manor reacted so slowly when Xia Qifei was assassinated? There were tens of thousands of provincial soldiers on Jiangnan Road. Why had not a single killer been caught after the incident? The 500 black-clothed killers swallowed Xia Qifei's group of carriages like a tide. Although Xia Qifei was the master of the Jiangnan water bandits and had countless brave men willing to risk their lives for him, in the face of such an unexpected surprise attack, he threw away all his heads and spilled all his blood. In the end, his defensive perimeter was broken through. The Jiangnan water bandits' new director died in battle. Guan Wumei, who had returned to Suzhou to help take care of affairs, also died in this assassination. Xia Qifei originally had no chance of survival. However, at this critical moment, an unremarkable Ming family servant carried the heavily injured Xia Qifei on his back. Relying on a cold sword in his hand, he killed his way out of the heavy encirclement and carried Xia Qifei back to the Ming family. The Ming garden was sealed and not opened for 3 days. When the provincial soldiers arrived at the scene of the assassination, other than the bodies of the Ming family servants and guards lying on the ground, they didn't find anything. The black-clothed killers didn't even leave a single body behind. That night, in the Jiangnan governor's manor, Governor Xue Qing and the 2 advisors looked at the intelligence report in their hands and began to think deeply. The court disregarded the shock of the world and still wanted to brazenly attack. It was already staking everything on one throw. In Jingdo, the emperor no longer wanted to play these empty games with Fan Xian and had already lost his patience. However, Xia Qifei had survived such a thunderous attack. This reality made Xue Qing feel slightly disappointed. Presently, the Ming garden had been sealed. The court could not openly break into the Jiangnan Ming family's garden. In the intelligence report, the swordsman who had carried Xia Qifei far away on his back had attracted Xue Qing's attention. To be able to break out of the encirclement when faced with hundreds of Qing elite soldiers, a martial artist with such ability had to be a 9th-level ace. There were not many 9th-level aces in the world. To be able to remain hidden by Xia Qifei's side and turn the tide in the end, it could only be a disciple of the sword hut that Fan Xian had sent. The Jiangnan matter did not end there. In this bloody storm, the assassination of the master of the Ming family was only a prelude. After the Ming family closed the garden, the headquarters of the Jiangnan water bandits in Shazhou began to mobilize their aces in preparation to rush to Suzhou. However, this group of reinforcements had only traveled halfway when they were stopped and disarmed by the provincial soldiers of the court. The Jiangnan Navy stationed in Shazhou took advantage of the emptiness of the Jiangnan water bandits to carry out the cruelest purge. The Jiangnan water bandits surrounded by the lake were burned by a big fire. No one knew how many people died. The fire burned for 3 days and 3 nights and did not stop. It burned the lake dry and burned the reeds into long incense sticks for sacrifice. There could be countless reasons for the court to purge the Jiangnan water bandits. However, what disappointed Xueqing was that the Jiangnan Navy was too ruthless. The group of water bandits they had stopped along the way were either dead or injured. The captives were also very stubborn. Not a single person was willing to open their mouth. Thus, his attempt to link the Ming family to the Jiangnan water bandits was forced to a halt. On the 3rd day of the Ming Garden's closure, the 4th young master of the Ming family died in the well. It was said that he felt guilty and jumped into the well to commit suicide. Immediately after, the people of the older faction of the Ming family began to gradually wither away. Xia Qifei, who had lost too many of his family and brothers, began a cruel counterattack. At least for now, the Ming Garden had finally stabilized under his bloody methods and the help of the Dongyi warriors. The effect of the court using such methods to deal with the Jiangnan giant merchant, the Ming family, was too bad. It could easily cause unrest among the people in Jiangnan and cause the other merchants to develop a sense of distrust toward the court. Furthermore, it should not be forgotten that Xia Qifei now also had the status of an official. His position as the Jiangnan supervisor of the Overwatch Council had not been removed, so the governor's manor would not admit that this matter had anything to do with the government. Under the Ming family's angry accusations and the Jingdou Overwatch Council headquarters questioning, with the Jiangnan governor's yamen as the leader, the governments of a few large provinces began to band together and diligently launch an investigation into the assassination of Xia Qifei. Of course, everyone could imagine that this investigation would never have any results. Strangely, no one, whether it was the government or the Ming family, brought up the Jiangnan water bandits that had disappeared in a sea of fire. It was as if the once glorious Jianghu power in Jiangnan had never existed. Compared to the inexplicable battle outside Sangzhou and the great victory at the mouth of Hong Mountain that decided the direction of history, the turmoil and killing in Jiangnan were not so eye-catching. The number of people who died was not as many as those 2 places, and the impact did not appear to be as large as those 2 places. The nobles and citizens of Jingdou only vaguely knew that there was a very rich family in Jiangnan that did not seem to be doing very well recently. However, the contest in Jiangnan was actually the true contest because it bore the largest portion of the Qing kingdom's tax revenue and a third of the people lived and worked in peace and contentment. Furthermore, Jiangnan had always been peaceful. Even when Fan Xian had gone down to Jiangnan and caused chaos, he had carefully controlled the disturbance within a certain range. Although he had provoked a movement of Jiangnan scholars into the streets, he had not caused Jiangnan to fall into chaos. This time Jiangnan had truly fallen into chaos. If Xia Qifei had not luckily survived and used even more ruthless methods to soothe his sorrowful heart, perhaps Jiangnan would have already completely fallen into the court's control. Regarding this, it could only be said that Fan Xian's luck in this life was indeed good. The trust he had placed in his trusted subordinates had completely exceeded the returns. The Cold War between the Emperor and Fan Xian became a hot battle in 3 important places. Other than these 3 places, something else happened outside Yingzhou. However, this matter did not attract too much attention. Su Wenmao, an official of the Overwatch Council and the head of the Palace Treasury Transport Company who had been stripped of his official position by the court and escorted back to Jingdou for trial, passed through Yingzhou. When the group of prisoner carriages had just left Yingzhou, they were attacked by a group of mountain bandits. That day, countless officials of the Ministry of Justice responsible for escorting the criminal officials were killed or injured. Su Wenmao had one of his arms chopped off. In the end, whether he was alive or dead was unknown. Back then, the Yingzhou mountain bandit was actually Guan Wumei, right? That year I took a boat down to Jiangnan. The first group I came into contact with was her. Then, through her connections, I found the 7th young master of the Ming dynasty, Xia Qifei. On the 28th of the 12th month of the 10th year of the Qing calendar, Jiangnan's intelligence finally arrived at the Fan Manor through Baoyue brothel. Fan Xian looked at the intelligence report in his hand and was silent for a moment. He then said, the Jiangnan water bandits had long been secretly recruited. The focus of the Hangzhou conference has always been in Yingzhou. The tragic scene after the river burst its banks has long disappeared. The present Yingzhou Zhizhou is a good official I personally picked. How could there be so many mountain bandits again? Fan Xian smiled, but his smile was slightly desolate. He turned his head to glance at Lin Wanner and said, you and I have struggled for so many years, but it still can't compare to the emperor's unreasonable and blind killing. When Fan Xian had come down to Jiangnan, he had passed by Yingzhou and found that the people's livelihood was difficult. Later, the palace treasury was rejuvenated. The court's national treasury was filled, and the palace treasury was plentiful. At the first moment, the Hangzhou conference that Lin Wanner hosted began to throw silver into the poor provinces on both sides of the Yangtze River. At that time, there was Fan Xian and Princess Chen's reputation holding the line. There was also the Overwatch Council's sinister surveillance, so there were no officials who dared to take silver from it. The people's livelihood in Jiangnan should be better than before. The Sword Hut sent a total of 6 people down to Jiangnan. I left 3 in the palace treasury because that is the most important place. The other 3 are mainly responsible for Xia Qifei and Su Wenmao's safety. I don't want these people following me to all die, Fan Xian said expressionlessly. Even so, such a big problem still occurred. I hope Wenmao will be able to survive. Lin Wanner watched him quietly from the side. She knew that there was a lot of pain and pressure in his heart. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought deeply for a moment. He then slowly raised his head. A flame seemed to begin to burn in his eyes. This flame was very much like the fire that had burned in the lake for 3 days and 3 nights. It was as if countless wronged souls were struggling, wailing, crying, and howling in this fire. The situation in Jingdou was also full of bitter wind and rain. Yan Bingyun was still in Dingzhou dealing with the matters of the Qingzhou battle. Even though he had already left Dingzhou, he still had to spend some time on the road. It was during this time that the Imperial Censorate took the opportunity to begin its pressure on the Overwatch Council. Of the 2 directors of the Overwatch Council, one was dead and the other was crippled. Yan Bingyun was unable to obtain the Overwatch Council's heartfelt obedience. A group of dragons was without a leader. Relying on the Emperor's indulgence and the cooperation of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, the Imperial Censorate began a cruel purge of the Overwatch Council under He Zhongwei's lead. The first to bear the brunt was the First Bureau. In just 3 days, over 30 Overwatch Council officials had been arrested and thrown into the Supreme Court. It was rare for the seemingly gentle civil officials to have a chance to act against the Overwatch Council. They would not be polite. The various torture devices in the prison all began to take effect. Defeated. Fan Xian had lost. He lost again and again until he was utterly defeated. Fan Xian knew he was wrong. The emperor was like Dong Mountain. Even if he created countless storms under heaven, as long as this mountain did not fall, the Qing court would not fall into chaos. No matter how big the storm, it would still be cold. The secret news that came from the heavenly palace was like the last straw that pressed down on Fan Xian's heart, forcing him to immediately make a choice. A beauty that had been chosen to enter the palace was said to be pregnant with a dragon's seed. Hearing this news, Fan Xian couldn't help but smile coldly. It looked like the celery's demon-killing effect was indeed not very effective against a monster like a great grandmaster. Xia Qifei is having a difficult time in Jiangnan. If I still don't act, he won't even be able to protect himself, much less support me. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly. The more of my power I lose, the more ruthless the emperor's methods will be. This is a matter that complements each other. At the beginning he will come slowly, but my counterattack power will become smaller and smaller. His worries will also become less and less, and his methods will become more and more crazy until he finally turns me into a loner. The court's actions in Jiangnan are actually very unwise, Lin Wanner said in a quiet voice. Anyone with eyes knows what the Ming family's predicament is. The court's actions this time are too obvious, and the methods they use are too bloody. I'm afraid the Jiangnan merchants will be at odds with each other from now on. Not only is it unwise, it can even be called stupid. However, it is very clear that the emperor does not care about this. He only cares about using the shortest amount of time to completely destroy me and shatter any hope I have. Fan Xian's expression was wooden. For some reason, it seems that he is also somewhat anxious. Lin Wanner looked at him. Her heart trembled slightly. Although the husband and wife did not say anything explicitly, she only needed one look to know what he was thinking in his heart. Particularly under such circumstances, his expression was enough to prove his thoughts. Just like this, two clear streams of tears flowed out from Wanner's eyes. She stared at Fan Xian in a daze and said in a trembling voice, "But what can you do?" Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then gently pulled her into his arms and held her as gently as if he was holding a child. In a quiet voice he said, "Although I have lost again and again and appear to have no power to retaliate, it actually proves something that I really want to know. The Emperor is in the end old. He is no longer as patient as he was in the past. He is steady and cold to a frightening degree and doesn't give people any chances." Fan Xian lowered his head and said by his wife's ear. Fan Xian lowered his head and said by his wife's ear, "After taking off that dragon robe, the Emperor is more like a normal person. Perhaps this is my opportunity." Time changed. Fan Xian did not have time to wait for the black-shrouded relative to return from the world of ice and snow. If he truly continued to wait like this, even if the Emperor continued to resist killing him, even if he waited until Uncle Wuzhu returned, at that time, everyone he cared about would probably all die, just like the people in the Jiangnan Water Bandits, Guan Wumei Su Wen Mao, and the officials in the Overwatch Council. He had to counterattack. Furthermore, he did indeed have a secret in his hands that even the Emperor did not know about. However, he knew that once the counterattack regarding the palace treasury truly began, there would be no turning back between Fan Xian's faction and the person in the royal palace. Perhaps the entire Qing kingdom would sink into chaos because of this. If Fan Xian lost, countless people behind him would probably die. Fan Xian did not have the confidence to defeat his emperor. When he bravely stood out with his life as the price, he had to leave a path of retreat for the family and friends he cared about. After that autumn rain, he no longer cared about his own life and death, but he still cared about the life and death of others. Because of this path of retreat, the Fan Manor was quiet for a long time after the 28th of the 12th lunar month. The atmosphere was oppressive for a long time. Even the two little children seemed to have noticed their father's strange emotions and no longer dared to make a loud noise. Because of this path of retreat, the Fan Manor was quiet for a long time after the 28th of the 12th lunar month. The atmosphere was oppressive for a long time. Even the two little children seemed to have noticed their father's strange emotions and didn't make any loud noises. After a very tasteless new year, Fan Xian casually ate some dumplings and shut himself in the study. He shut himself in for 7 days. It was not until the 7th that he came out of the study. Everyone in the manor was waiting outside the study. Lin Wanner stood to the side and looked at him worriedly. Cici brought a bowl of ginseng soup to his hands. Cici's heart skipped a beat. She suddenly felt an ominous premonition, but she bit her lips tightly and did not make a sound. She believed that the young master she had watched grow up was not immortal. No matter what kind of predicament he faced, he would easily solve it, just like he had in the past 20 years. On the 7th day of the new year, classes began at the Imperial College. After washing up, Lin Wanner helped him tidy up his clothes and sent him to the main entrance of the mansion. On the way there, her hands trembled slightly. The morning sunlight broke through the cold clouds that had sealed the capital for a long time and shone down coldly. Lin Wanner stared at Fan Xian's handsome cheek in a daze. She didn't know if she would ever see it again. Suddenly, she saw a strand of white hair on Fan Xian's temple, shining in the morning light. She couldn't help but feel her heart wrench in pain. She tried her best to remain calm as she asked, "Have you figured anything out after thinking for 7 days?" Fan Xian sighed and recovered the laziness and helplessness he had when he first entered Jingdo. He smiled and said, "Thinking for 7 days, hoping to become a great grandmaster. Don't you think I'm being too delusional?" Lin Wanner covered her mouth and laughed. "What wishful thinking. There has been a reply to the message I asked Eunuch Dai to deliver to the palace before the new year. His Majesty has asked me to enter the palace in the afternoon." Fan Xian glanced at his wife with pity. "His Majesty has always loved you. Adding to the fact that he is old, I don't think he will make things difficult for you. If you are not comfortable in Jingdo, go back to Danzhou. His Majesty has to give grandmother some face." Lin Wanner continued to cover her mouth and asked with a smile, "I'm too lazy to leave. I'll wait for you at home. But have you really thought of something?" Fan Xian shrugged his shoulders and said like a ruffian, "What idea? His Majesty doesn't have any openings on his body? Ah, I remember. A man surnamed Xiong once said that since he doesn't have openings on his body, then he has openings." "You're joking again." Lin Wanner covered her mouth and laughed until she was about to cough out tears. I was joking anyway. Fan Xian lowered his head and gently kissed Wanner on the forehead. He then climbed into the carriage without turning his head. Watching the carriage head in the direction of Dongchuan Road and the Imperial College, the smile on Lin Wanner's face immediately turned into desolation. She lowered the sleeve she had covered her mouth with. There were 2 spots of blood on the white sleeve. These 7 days had been difficult for her. Her old illness had relapsed and she was very sad. Confucius said to become righteous. Mencius said to take righteousness. Only when righteousness is done, then benevolence is at its peak. Reading the books of the saints, what have you learned? I have no regrets. Since ancient times, those with lofty ideals who believed in righteousness under heaven should not be moved by success or failure. A voice, so calm and even slightly cold, rang out in front of the little lake in the Imperial College. More than 100 students of the Imperial College listened quietly to Sir Fan Jr.'s lesson. Many people felt that Sir Fan Jr.'s mood was strange. He seemed to like to joke mischievously, but those mischievous jokes were not very funny. Many people felt that Sir Fan Jr. had something on his mind. Hu the scholar watched this scene quietly from under a large tree. His old heart was comforted. He thought he knew what Fan Xian was worried about, so he was comforted. It was the 7th day of the new year, the first class of the Imperial College. In the afternoon, the emperor would summon Fan Xian into the palace. The upper echelons of the Qing court all knew that it was Fan Xian who had invited them into the palace this time. Naturally, Hu the scholar thought that under the emperor's repeated blows and in front of the great battle results the Qing kingdom had achieved, Fan Xian had admitted defeat. Thinking of the Qing kingdom ruler and officials being of one mind, father and son of one mind, unifying the world and living in harmony, Hu the scholar felt incomparably comforted. He didn't even pay attention to the specific contents of Fan Xian's lesson. Kong is not Jiao Kong pretending to be Wang Li Hong. It is not Kong Ming waving a fan, and it is even less likely to mean eye-catching. Mencius, I don't really like this person because he likes to argue too much. He is similar to me. Fan Xian smiled as he lectured to the 100 Imperial College students by the lake. He didn't care whether or not these students could understand. There were indeed collections of classics and history in this world, but there were no Confucius, Mencius or many other philosophers. There were theories of benevolence and righteousness, but very few were as clear as what Confucius said. Such a thing as risking one's life for righteousness must occasionally be done, but I'm not that kind of person. I have always been afraid of death. After these words were said, all of the Imperial College students laughed. They felt that in Sir Fan Jr.'s messy lecture, a joke that they could understand had finally appeared. But Fan Xian's expression suddenly became cold. After waiting for the surroundings to quiet down, he said word by word, "How many people are different from animals? Is it only those who value righteousness? Not necessarily. A person's instinct is to seek life and avoid death. However, a person is worthy of respect when they can bravely meet death. Why meet death? Naturally, it is because there are things in this world that are more important than life and death. This still has nothing to do with me." He smiled. Then there was silence all around. Everyone felt that something was strange. All of the Imperial College students stared in a daze at him by the lake. No one laughed out loud. I had always thought that there was nothing in this world more important than one's own life and death. Later, I discovered that a person's desire is an extraordinary thing. A person having the right to choose is an extraordinary thing. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said, "Since we are going to die, then we have to choose a way for us to die to our heart's content." Although the phrase, "no regrets" is a bit vulgar, in the end it is still a very practical thing. How should a person live their life? Fan Xian looked around and asked this question. Naturally no one answered. After a moment of silence, his voice reverberated through the quiet Imperial College. "I've thought about this question my entire life and still haven't understood it. Copying many books, earning a lot of money, marrying many wives, having many children. I seem to have done it all. Then I thought about it for a long time and came to a general conclusion. It is to live however I want as long as I live with a clear conscience. This is roughly what I want to say today." After saying this, Fan Xian left the Imperial College and sat in the lonely black carriage, leaving behind a group of confused and baffled young Imperial College students looking at each other, as well as Hu the scholar, whose expression had changed dramatically after he finally understood what Fan Xian was saying. Hu the scholar left the Imperial College in fear and hurried in the direction of the royal palace. It was still early. Fan Xian would only be able to enter the palace in the afternoon. He hoped he still had time to say something to the emperor, advise him and prevent something from happening. Fan Xian's rambling speech in the Imperial College spread out in the shortest amount of time. There was no need for people with intentions to add fuel to the fire. In reality, all of Jingdo, those sensitive people had been waiting for this Jingdo idler's reaction. In contrast to all of these people's hurried nervousness, Fan Xian was very calm. There was still some time before he entered the palace. He arrived at Xingfeng restaurant and began to enjoy the rare, perhaps last, enjoyment of the winter. A few steaming baskets of jietong buns as well as De Bao, who had a bun face on the side of the table. Chapter 729. A pair of long chopsticks pierced into the longan of the jietong bun and pulled it apart to reveal the delicious and tempting broth inside. Fan Xian took out a ladle and scooped out the broth and ladled it into the porcelain bowl in front of De Bao. He then picked out the meat stuffing and placed it on top of De Bao's zhajiangmian. Little Xian, eat. De Bao lowered his head as he attacked the food. His words were unclear but unusually determined. Hearing his tone, he was truly worried that Fan Xian would give everything to him and that he wouldn't be full. Fan Xian looked at his brother-in-law and smiled. He used his hands to tear open the soft and white skin of the jietong bun and soaked it in the kelp soup. He casually took a few bites. Ever since he had taken over his position in the first bureau of the Overwatch Council, he liked to eat buns in Xingfeng restaurant. Each time he came to eat buns he would bring De Bao. He knew that De Bao only liked to eat the meat stuffing and had no interest in the skin of the buns. Thus, it was suitable for the two brothers to work together. Glancing at the happy and sweaty De Bao, for some reason, Fan Xian's heart began to ache. He didn't know if he would have such an opportunity to waste time with his brother-in-law in the future. He liked being together with De Bao. Only when he was with De Bao could he truly relax. He could tell De Bao all of his secrets, his views of the world, and he wouldn't have to worry about De Bao betraying him. After today it would probably be very difficult to eat buns with De Bao again. It would also be very difficult to lie at the bow of the boat with De Bao and talk about how the starry sky of the Qing Kingdom was so similar to the starry sky of that world. Fan Xian's face still carried a warm and encouraging smile as he looked at De Bao, but he sighed in his heart. He couldn't taste his food. Grabbing a towel beside the table, he wiped away the grease on his hands and turned his head slightly. Separated by the railing of the second floor of Xingfeng restaurant, he looked at the two yamens across the street. The Supreme Court of the Qing Kingdom and the first branch of the Overwatch Council were both across the street from Xingfeng restaurant. Today was the 7th day of the new year. It was the first day of duty for court officials after the end of the year. On this day, other than the interaction between the various departments, the exchange of well wishes and the exchange of red packets, there were actually no important political matters that needed to be handled. Inside a yamen, everyone was basically having a tea party. From the main official to the lowest level of scribes, everyone was holding a teapot, eating melon seeds and chatting leisurely. This was the custom of the entire world's officialdom. Even the one in the palace knew this. After all, it was the atmosphere of the new year. When on duty it was very idle and there was nothing to do. Naturally, the shift ended even earlier. It was clearly not time yet. The sun hiding behind the cold clouds in the sky had not yet moved to its southern zenith. Across the street, many officials walked out of the yamen of the Supreme Court. These officials met up with the officials from the other departments who had been waiting outside the yamen. Like birds and beasts they scattered on the street. No one knew where they had gone to enjoy the delicacies of Jingdo. On the first day of duty, it was not a crime to eat and drink at noon. It was even possible that after getting drunk, they would return to their manors to rest in the afternoon. Different from the Supreme Court, the first branch of the Overwatch Council's yamen, which was clearly much more wretched and sinister, still had its doors tightly shut. There were no officials going in to do business, and there were no idle people walking around laughing and laughing. A depressing atmosphere that made one's head droop emanated from the courtyard. Fan Xian looked calmly at the familiar courtyard, which he had once controlled with one hand. He knew very well why it was like this. The Overwatch Council was facing a bleak storm. Its position in court had dropped 1,000 li, particularly in the previous month. Many Overwatch Council officials had been arrested by the Ministry of Justice and the Supreme Court on some groundless charges. Although they knew that it was the Imperial Censorate leading the purge, the Overwatch Council seemed to have lost its former magic. It was no longer able to gather its true power and give the most powerful counterattack. With He Zongwei at the head, the Imperial Censorate faintly suppressed Hu the Scholar and began to lead the entire system of civil officials to launch an attack on the Overwatch Council. No one knew how many Overwatch Council officials had welcomed cruel punishments in prison. The Qing Kingdom was long no longer the Qing Kingdom with the old cripple. A wave of steady footsteps and self-contained laughter came from the stairs. About 7 or 8 officials walked up from downstairs. Looking at their clothing, they were all high-ranking officials. These officials did not go to the private rooms on the 3rd floor. Instead, under the guidance of the owner, they came to the railing and prepared to put up a screen and sit against the railing. Xingfeng Restaurant had not been famous in the past. Although it was opposite the Supreme Court and First Bureau of the Overwatch Council, the officials always felt that the place was too low class. Even in the private rooms, there were no girls to serve them, so they would rather go further. It was not until later that Fan Xian often came here to lean against the railing and munch on meat buns that he forcefully raised the reputation of Xingfeng Restaurant. From then on, there was an additional type of elegance. Most of the officials who came to Xingfeng Restaurant were from the Supreme Court. The main guest was Hou Jichang, who had just been transferred back to the capital from Jiaozhou. The officials of the Supreme Court knew that this person, who had once been one of Fan Xian's 4 disciples, had now put down his status and thrown himself under the tutelage of scholar He, who had once been as famous as him. Only then did he have the wonderful matter of being transferred directly into the Supreme Court. The changes in the world truly made one sigh. The officials couldn't help but feel some disdain toward Hou Jichang's betrayal of Fan Xian. However, no one was willing to show it on their faces. It was Hou Jichang's first time in the Supreme Court, so he was invited to Xingfeng Restaurant to treat. In order to give scholar He face, even the deputy of the Supreme Court personally came to accompany him. Arriving at the railing, the officials prepared to sit down. Before the screen came up, they could see the table on the other side of the railing. There were only 3 people at that table. A person who looked like a bodyguard had clearly finished eating and was looking around warily. The fat man facing the officials had his head lowered and was chewing fiercely. The person facing the officials was wearing commoner clothing. He raised his head to look at the other end of the street. It was just his back view, but it made everyone's heart thump. Hou Jichang's body froze. The hands that were exposed outside his official robes began to tremble uncontrollably. It was as if the cold wind outside had instantly eroded every inch of his skin. The other officials of the Supreme Court had only been shocked by the bleak back view and did not recognize that person's identity. Looking at Hou Jichang's deathly pale face, they couldn't help feeling incomparably shocked. They followed Hou Jichang's gaze and looked again. Finally, they understood where Hou Jichang's fear lay. After a moment of awkward silence, the deputy furrowed his brows and gently patted Hou Jichang's shoulder. In a quiet and comforting voice he said, "Sit." Hou Jichang sat down restlessly. After a long time he sighed with some shame. If this had been any other time in the past, this table of officials would certainly have gone to that table to respectfully greet Fan Xian. Now, not only did Fan Xian not have any official positions, but even his status as a first-rank duke had been taken away by the emperor. He had become a completely white person and was nothing more than a commoner. This table of officials of the Supreme Court were all He Zhongwei's direct subordinates. They knew that Sir Fan Jr. was on the other side of the railing and that they were on the other side of the railing. Naturally, they could not leave. What reason was there for an official to give way to a commoner? What reason was there for the He faction, currently in the limelight, to give way to a drowning dog? The imperial censor of the left was a rather important position. Sir Gui smiled boastfully and raised his cup of wine in a toast. However, when his gaze landed on the other side of the railing, just like Hou Jichang, his expression became rather unnatural. Imperial censor Gui's surname was Guizheng. He was the person who had wanted to punish Fan Xian in the Jingdo government. Now that so many years had passed, the people of Jingdo had probably long forgotten this matter. However, Guizheng believed that Fan Xian would not forget and he would not forget. Because in the Jiangnan Palace treasury matter, Guizheng had also stood against Fan Xian. The wine hadn't gone through 3 rounds when the 3 silent people on the other side of the railing had already finished eating. Fan Xian held the Bao's hand and walked toward the stairs. Ting Zijing followed silently behind. If the 3 of them wanted to go down, they had to pass the table where the officials were gathered. Unexpectedly, the officials at this table all quieted down at the same time with a glimmer of nervousness, waiting for the young master to quickly leave. However, Fan Xian did not leave. Very naturally, he came to the side of this table and looked at the officials with a slight smile. Seeing that the situation was not right, the deputy of the Supreme Court smiled awkwardly and stood up. Raising his hands in a salute, he said, "So, it is Sir Fan Jr. I." Only after he said the word, "I," did he realize that something was wrong. The other party was already a commoner. As a proper deputy of the Supreme Court, how could he say "I"? The deputy stopped his mouth and steeled his heart. With a forced smile, he said, "Would you like to sit together?" Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. Ho Jichang had already stood up in fear. Lowering his head, he bowed toward Fan Xian. Cold sweat soaked through his back, but Fan Xian did not even glance at him. It was as if he did not exist. It was this kind of disregard that made everyone at the table feel a glimmer of coldness. Fan Xian did not look at Ho Jichang. He looked at the new imperial censor of the left beside him, Guozheng. In a quiet voice he said, 3 years ago I was very curious. I exiled you to Jiangnan, making you uneasy day and night. Later, when the Jingdo rebellion occurred, you were clearly a Xinjiang person, so why did the emperor not issue an edict to punish you? Later I understood. You saw that the situation was not right, so you abandoned my poor mother-in-law and used your old friendship in the imperial censorate to hug Izongwei's thigh. Fan Xian smiled and shook his head with a sigh. Izongwei, that bastard, is a servant of 3 surnames. Naturally you, a fence-sitter, learned everything from him. Presently Izongwei was an important figure in court. With Fan Xian's cutting words, all of the officials at the table could not sit still. Abruptly they stood up and prepared to scold him. I was wrong. Izongwei is not a servant of 3 surnames. The previous masters he served were all surnamed Li. Fan Xian shook his head. It should be said that he is a loyal dog of the Li family. The deputy of the Supreme Court finally couldn't resist and said something with a cold expression. However, Fan Xian seemed to not have heard it. He only looked coldly at the trembling Guozheng. Enunciating each word, he asked, "For you to be transferred back to Jingdo to take up the post of imperial censor of the left, presumably you have performed a great service in Jiangnan. I was wondering if the deaths of my subordinates in Jiangnan had anything to do with you?" Guozheng steeled his heart and said in a cold voice, "I am carrying out my duties by imperial edict. Does Sir Fan Jr. have any objections?" "Very good, you finally have some backbone. This is what an imperial censor should be like," Fan Xian slowly said. "I knew you were entering the capital today, so I made a special trip here to wait for you." The atmosphere in Xingfeng restaurant immediately became like the calm before a storm. It was so quiet that it made one's heart palpitate. Especially waiting for Guozheng. What did this mean? Although until now no one believed that Fan Xian would risk universal condemnation and do something to disgrace the court in such an important place in Jingdo, looking at Fan Xian's increasingly indifferent face, everyone felt a glimmer of coldness and fear. There were not many guards following these officials into Xingfeng restaurant. After all, no one would have thought that such a major incident would occur right across the street from the Supreme Court. Feeling the strange atmosphere upstairs, a few guards rushed up and watched the scene nervously. Fan Xian smiled. The deputy of the Supreme Court smiled awkwardly along with him. Guozheng smiled very awkwardly. Then a plate of food landed directly on Guozheng's face. Vegetable juices and broken porcelain flew together. At the same time the imperial censor's face split open, turning into countless rays of light that sprayed out. What sprayed out at the same time was the fresh blood that sprayed out from Guozheng's face. Fan Xian pulled back his hand and pressed it against the back of Guozheng's head, pressing it directly into the hard pearwood table. Such a hard table forcefully pressed a head made of flesh and blood into it. With a crack, a few fine cracks appeared on the surface of the pearwood table. Guozheng's cervical vertebra was completely broken. Blood seeped out from the gap between his facial bones and the pearwood table like black water. He didn't even have time to grunt. Sir Guozheng, who had just performed a great service for the court in Jiangnan and had returned to Jingdo to take over as the imperial censor of the left, was slammed into the table by Fan Xian's palm and became a dead man. There was a death-like silence. Everyone present stared stupidly at the deeply sunken head on the table and the table full of blood mixed with vegetable juices. They were speechless because no one dared to believe the scene they saw. Everyone thought it was an illusion. Killing on the street. Killing an official of the court. Killing an imperial censor of the left in front of so many officials. This was something that had never happened in Jingdo before. It was also something no one could imagine. No one could react at all. They only watched this scene as if they were watching an absurd play. Finally, an official reacted. He let out a terrified scream. Then his eyes rolled back and he fainted. The guards charged over and attacked Fan Xian. However, there were only a number of muffled thuds. A few fainted bodies appeared on the wooden boards of the second floor of Xingfeng restaurant. Fan Xian continued to stand quietly by the table as if he had never attacked. The deputy of the Supreme Court extended a trembling finger and pointed it at Fan Xian. It was as if he had seen a demon from the netherworld suddenly walking under the sunlight. He couldn't say anything. His throat only made pitiful whimpering sounds. Fan Xian's eyes were expressionless. He looked at him coldly and asked, "I heard that during this month the Supreme Court, under your orders, has used a great deal of torture on my subordinates. 3 of my subordinates were tortured to death by you in prison?" The deputy of the Supreme Court suddenly let out a loud cry and turned to run like a rabbit. Looking at his momentum, it looked like he was going to flip over the railing. Even if he fell heavily, he was going to run out of Xingfeng restaurant. However, since Fan Xian had already begun to act, how could he let him escape? There was only the sound of a gust of wind brushing past the pavilion of Xingfeng restaurant. There was another crisp crack and a muffled thud. The deputy of the Supreme Court's cervical vertebrae snapped. His head was also smashed wretchedly into the hard pearwood table. Blood began to flow down the table, and the heads of the 2 officials of the imperial court sank into the table, unable to escape. Their corpses were half kneeling on the ground, and the tips of their feet, which were wearing thick boots, were still twitching. It was a horrifying scene. Killing 2 people on the street filled Xingfeng restaurant with the cries of ghosts and wails of deities. However, Fan Xian's expression did not change. He turned around. A waiter from Xingfeng restaurant had unknowingly appeared behind the crowd and handed over a steaming hot towel. Fan Xian accepted the towel and carefully wiped his hands. He then threw the towel to the ground with some disgust. Holding De Bao's hand, he walked down the stairs and said to the waiter, "You can begin." From the moment Fan Xian walked to this table to the moment he used the cruelest method to kill the 2 court officials to the moment he walked down the stairs and left, he did not glance at Ho Jichang. With a pale face, Ho Jichang's lips trembled. He withdrew his gaze from the stairs and looked at the 2 corpses. Looking at the blood flowing on the table, he didn't know whether it was brain or bean curd. Endless fear took over his whole body. Finally, he couldn't help but bend over and vomit uncontrollably. "Take uncle back to the manor." Below Xingfeng restaurant, Fan Xian helped De Bao onto the carriage and spoke to Ting Zijing. He then watched the black carriage head toward the south of the city. Fan Xian, alone, began to head in the direction of the royal palace. Fan Xian was not worried about the safety of the carriage going home. Along the way there were swordsmen of the 6th Bureau responsible for protecting it. Just as he had said in Xingfeng restaurant, killing was to avenge the subordinates of the Overwatch Council. Although he was no longer the director of the Overwatch Council as long as he wanted to, he would always be the director of the Overwatch Council. The Shadow returned to Jingdo and reorganized the 6th Bureau assassins who had long been hiding in the dark. The arrival of Haitang, particularly 13th Wang, made it impossible for the royal palace to stop Fan Xian from reconnecting with the people loyal to him in the 8 bureaus of the Overwatch Council. The Overwatch Council was already in a state of turmoil. Today could be considered this sinister council's last moment of glory. In the morning, Fan Xian, in the name of the director of the Overwatch Council, gave one last order to the spies and assassins the Overwatch Council had set up in various places. He didn't know how many secret agents and officials would follow him. Fan Xian believed that the men under his command would not disappoint him. The cold winter wind blew through the streets of Jingdo. There was still some time before he had to enter the palace. Fan Xian walked alone along the streets toward the royal palace in the distance. Along the way, he looked at the Jingdo streets and greedily breathed in the air. It was as if he wanted to engrave all of this into his memory. Even if he died, he wouldn't forget it. Not long after Fan Xian left Xingfeng restaurant, the 1st Bureau of the Overwatch Council, which had its doors closed the entire time, suddenly came out. 100 black-robed Overwatch Council officials surged murderously into their old neighbor and now their most despicable new enemy, the Supreme Court. It had to be said that the 7th day Fan Xian had chosen was indeed the best time. It was not yet noon, but the officials of the Supreme Court had long gone to enjoy themselves with the officials of the other departments. The Supreme Court's Yamen had no power to resist in front of these wolf-like Overwatch Council officials. This coincidentally matched Fan Xian's hopes that there wouldn't be too many Qing officials who would bleed because of this turmoil. The court officials who were going to die had their reasons for dying. They were all targets that Fan Xian had carefully chosen. The 1st Bureau had entered the Supreme Court to rescue their colleagues who had been sent to prison by the court. Fan Xian walked through Chang Street and turned Shei Street. He bought a skewer of candied haws from a vendor and ate it with relish. Carelessly he tossed a golden leaf. He couldn't be bothered to ask for change. He was very grateful to Jingdo's candied haws. Back then, it was because of the candied haws in that child's hands that he hadn't gotten lost in the Qing temple. At noon, the Minister of Revenue was entertaining guests in Yishur Tavern. He had invited the assistant minister of the Ministry of Justice and a few good friends. As expected, they were all core figures of the He faction. The minister gently stroked his short beard. He felt slightly proud in the warm winter room. After 3 years of hard work, he had finally cleared away the shadow the previous minister Fan Jian had left in the ministry. The independent kingdom that belonged to the Fan Manor no longer existed. He had finally become the true minister of revenue. In order to resist the pressure from the Fan Manor, he had taken the initiative and humbly stood by Scholar He's side. He did not feel humiliated because He Zongwei had always been a scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Furthermore, standing by Scholar He's side was like standing in front of the emperor. This was an honor. Originally, the banquet should have been held at night to appear more formal. However, the guests who had gone to the He Manor to ask around had found out. Furthermore, after the court meeting before the new year, Scholar He had to explain that there were matters to be done in the palace on the 7th. Thus, Scholar He could not personally attend the banquet. Thus, the time had been moved to noon. Although he was slightly disappointed, the Minister of Revenue also let out a breath. Scholar He was not here, so he was the highest-ranking official at this table. Hearing the flattery by his ear, how happy was his mood. He had just reported to Scholar He's will. The Ministry of Revenue had forcefully interfered and played the Jingdo Yamen to the point where they wished they were dead, forcing the stubborn Sun Jingxiu to quietly resign. In the end, he still could not pay the silver to discuss his crimes and was sent to prison. The minister began to feel like he wished he were dead. What did you have to fight with me? Isn't it just because you have a good daughter? After your daughter is sold to the musical house, I'm going to secretly make your daughter feel like she's about to die. The alcohol had gotten to his head. Smiling at the dumbstruck officials inside, he said, "Long time no see." Scholar He, who was sitting on the heated Kong and reading all kinds of memorials, slowly raised his head and glanced at the uninvited guest at the door. His brows furrowed. Chapter 730. The row of single-story buildings at the foot of the royal palace were unremarkable, but they were important places for the Hall of Governmental Affairs to discuss matters. Passing through a courtyard in the back corridor, one could directly enter the palace. It was the most important place. The imperial army and guards guarded it tightly. Even when the rebel army had surrounded the palace, they had not thought of opening a gap from here because there were still layers of palace walls behind the Hall of Governmental Affairs. In the blink of an eye, it had been almost 7 years since he left Danzhou in the spring of the 4th year of the Qing calendar. Other than the 2 years he had stayed intermittently in Jiangnan, most of the truly exciting, tense and memorable times of Fan Xian's second life had been in Jingdo. His life and identity were different from most people in the Qing kingdom. He had entered the palace too many times. It was as easy and comfortable as going home. Regardless of whether it was his identity as the commissioner of the Overwatch Council or his identity as the emperor's illegitimate child, the restrictions of the palace did not exist for him. On the 7th day of the new year, Fan Xian strolled to the row of single-story buildings below the royal palace like he was taking a stroll. Although the new year had just passed, the Hall of Governmental Affairs was still busy. Officials from various departments had come to discuss matters. No one noticed a figure holding a black cloth umbrella in the snow. Entering the inner area, the imperial soldiers and guards responsible for inspection were dumbfounded by Fan Xian's warm smile. They watched in a daze as he walked in. Fan Xian had come too naturally and naturally. All of the imperial soldiers and guards were familiar with the fact that this young man could enter and leave the royal palace without any hindrance. For a moment they did not react. They allowed him to pass through layers of guards and come directly to the main room of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. There were 2 heated Kong beds in the main room. A few layers of things were thrown haphazardly on top. Memorials from various places, as well as edicts the emperor had drafted, were piled everywhere. Ink and paper were piled haphazardly on the table. In the center of the Qing court, the working conditions did not look good. A few scholars and scribes were busy until Fan Xian put down the black umbrella dripping with snow water. The main room of the Hall of Governmental Affairs was silent. Everyone stared in a daze at Fan Xian. They didn't know why this figure, who had been severely punished by the emperor, would suddenly appear here. As Fan Xian walked through the streets of Jingdo, the various restaurants and yamens in Jingdo had already changed. However, the timing of the attack this time was perfect. Even if everyone knew that the blood in Jingdo had been shed under Sir Fan Jr.'s order, before they investigated clearly, who would go forward to capture Fan Xian? Particularly in a situation where Fan Xian had not made the first move, how could the imperial army generals and internal court guards dare to rashly charge forward? There was panic at the foot of the royal palace. The sound of soldiers being mobilized rang out everywhere. In an instant, urgent sounds came from outside the large room of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Countless imperial soldiers surrounded the room, surrounding Fan Xian and the officials who actually controlled the Qing court inside. Even if Fan Xian had a pair of wings, he probably wouldn't be able to fly out. However, it seemed that he didn't want to escape. He just looked calmly at He Zongwei behind the crowd and casually took a step forward. This step shattered the courage of countless officials. Cries of surprise rang out in the room. The dozen guards surrounding Fan Xian pressed forward. Fan Xian stopped his steps and looked at He Zongwei not far away through the heads of the crowd. Calmly he said, "Perhaps it is as many people say, you are actually a capable official. In the future, it is very likely that you will become a famous official whose name will go down in history." Then he shook his head and said, "However, I won't give you this opportunity to continue living. Speaking of which, it's strange. For some reason, I loathe you so much. This loathing is completely without reason. You are too materialistic and always want to step on others to climb up. This kind of behavior is what I dislike the most. Even if I don't like it, at most I'll just punch you a few times." Unexpectedly, "You later threw your entire life into opposing me," Fan Xian said with a slight smile. "It's a pity that this career is not very glorious. On the contrary, it gives me even more reasons to kill you." Fan Xian smiled warmly. In the eyes of everyone in the room, this smile was sinister, terrifying, and full of murderous intent. However, he didn't seem to have any intention of attacking. Thus, the imperial soldiers and guards around him didn't move lightly. They were terrified of provoking this figure's craziness and starting a massacre. Hearing the latter part of Fan Xian's words, a severe light flashed through He Zongwei's eyes. He prepared to open his mouth and say something coldly. Unexpectedly, a sharp pain came from his abdomen. This pain was very real and very wretched. It immediately made his face pale. He couldn't say a word. "You are a petty person who is passionate about materialism and doesn't care about the cost to climb up. You can hide it from the emperor, the officials of the court, and even the people of the world. But how can you hide it from me?" Fan Xian's gaze became cold. "Your seemingly clean hands are stained with the blood of many people. Just how many people's wrong souls are on your official robes? You know, and I know. Today I am killing you and your He faction officials to carry out justice on behalf of heaven and to help the emperor cleanse the emperor's side." Fan Xian said words that even he didn't believe. He looked mockingly at He Zongwei's pale face, bullying him for not being able to say a word. "I don't understand why you would do anything to climb up and step on the corpses of my subordinates to climb up. Later I finally understood. It is not because of the natural enmity between the Imperial Censorate and the Overwatch Council. It is also not because I am unwilling to marry my sister to you. Furthermore, it is not because the Emperor has any instructions for you." Fan Xian sighed with pity. "All of this is because you are jealous of me. You are not as good as me in literature, martial arts, reputation, or power. No matter how hard you work or how many big black dogs you raise, you will never be able to catch up to me in this lifetime. Of course you are not convinced. You are not convinced that I have a good father and mother. However, this is fate. What is there to be unconvinced about?" A few soybean-sized beads of sweat rolled down He Zongwei's pale forehead. He stared at Fan Xian with a pair of hateful eyes. He wanted to angrily say something, but he didn't have the strength to open his mouth. He already had no strength to stand. Dispiritedly, he sat on the side of the Kong. "This is grievance. The grievance of the emperor is the source of internal chaos in the Qing kingdom." Fan Xian stared at He Zongwei sitting on the side of the Kong. Enunciating each word, he said, "Too much grievance prevents heartbreak. Today I will grant you a heartbreak." Every word and sentence was like a small knife stabbing into He Zongwei's ears. Even if he didn't want to hear it, he had no choice. He knew that the officials of his He faction had all died today. Furthermore, Fan Xian had to have a backup plan in secret. However, he didn't know why Fan Xian would say so many useless things in front of so many officials. The officials had died. As long as he was alive, he would still have the emperor's favor. In the future, he would be able to nurture his own power again. But why was it that after those small knives entered his ears, they began to move randomly around his abdomen? Why was it that those knives were cutting his intestines and making him wish he was dead? "I will grant you a heartbreak." After these words were said, the atmosphere in the row of single-story houses at the foot of the royal palace immediately became tense. All of the officials scattered in all directions to avoid Fan Xian's storm-like attacks that might immediately appear. The imperial soldiers endlessly surged in from outside the house and formed into countless rows, blocking in front of He Zongwei. The fully armored imperial soldiers formed a formation and squeezed the spacious Hall of Governmental Affairs room until it was particularly cramped. They stared nervously at Fan Xian, who was alone. Just as the swords were drawn and the fight was about to break out at any moment, a mournful and urgent cry came from the courtyard of the Hall of Governmental Affairs against the royal palace walls. No! Hu the scholar, covered in snow and water, charged in from the direction of the royal palace. After hearing Fan Xian's speech at the Imperial College this morning, he knew that something big was going to happen in Jingdo. He had rushed to the royal palace at the first opportunity. However, he had been delayed for a while. He only had time to say a few words to the emperor before he heard a eunuch report that court officials had mysteriously died in various places in Jingdo. Immediately after, there was an urgent report that Fan Xian had already killed his way into the Hall of Governmental Affairs. No one dared to stop Hu the scholar. At such a tense moment, no one cared about his entrance. At most, a few officials of the Hall of Governmental Affairs saw Hu the scholar rush to Fan Xian's side. They were worried that he would be injured by Fan Xian, this madman, and cried out in worry. Hu the scholar paid no attention to these cries. He grabbed Fan Xian from behind and used his old life to drag Fan Xian back. In a loud and panicked voice he yelled, "You're crazy!" In everyone's eyes, everything that had happened today showed that Sir Fan Jr., whose talent in poetry had shocked the world, was clearly crazy. Otherwise, how could he trample on the dignity of the court and do so many heinous and treasonous things? If what had happened in Jingdo was not rebellion, what could it be? Hu the scholar knew that just the matter of those officials being assassinated in Jingdo was enough to anger the emperor and send Fan Xian to eternal damnation. However, he still held on to Fan Xian with all his might, not letting him act. Killing a scholar in the Hall of Governmental Affairs was like spilling blood in front of the palace. Not only in the Qin kingdom but in the entire world, such a hair-raising scene had never appeared before. The scene was comical and funny, but no one laughed. It was completely silent at the foot of the palace walls. Everyone watched in fear as Hu the scholar used his old and weak body to hold on to Fan Xian with all his might. How could he drag and hold on to him? Fan Xian suddenly felt a glimmer of warmth finally grow in his icy cold heart. He smiled and lowered his head. Let go, it's already too late. Behind him, Hu the scholar's body froze. Trembling, he loosened his grip and glanced at Fan Xian with disbelief. He Zongwei, who had been hiding behind the crowd and sitting in fear on the edge of the Kong, suddenly retched and spat out a mouthful of black blood. The blood soaked through the robes of many officials in front of him. It was black and ugly. Cries of surprise rang out in the room. A few officials quickly went forward to support He Zongwei and began to desperately call for a royal doctor. He Zongwei's eyes began to dim, and his hearing also began to fade. He could not clearly hear what his colleagues beside him were shouting. He could only clearly feel the pain in his abdomen. Those little knives seemed to have successfully chopped his passionate and hot-blooded intestines into pieces. He Zongwei knew he couldn't make it. He didn't know when Fan Xian had poisoned him. He also didn't notice the small needle mark on the little finger of his right hand. He just felt dissatisfied. He clearly had hot-bloodedness toward the world and the court. He was willing to shed his blood for a clear reputation. Why was it that in the end what he spat out was a puddle of black blood? His blurry gaze searched for Fan Xian's cold face. There was great resentment and dissatisfaction in his heart. As an official, what was wrong with working for the emperor in the court? Was it to kill some people and betray some people? For thousands of years, hadn't people in officialdom always done this? Did Fan Xian not let innocent people die because of him? You didn't have to betray anyone because you were born to be the master, while we were born to be the servants. He Zongwei wanted to angrily ask Fan Xian, what right do you have to use those strange reasons to kill me? You're just a wastrel who doesn't see the big picture and only does things according to your own likes and dislikes. However, in the end he couldn't say this question. The black blood gushing endlessly from his lips stopped him from speaking and breathing. Just before the royal doctor rushed over, the scholar and imperial censor, the most popular person in the Qin court these 3 years, He Zongwei, died at the foot of the royal palace, in the yamen of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. He spat up blood and died with his intestines broken. During this process, Fan Xian had been watching He Zongwei calmly and coldly, even callously. He watched him vomit blood, watched him struggle in pain, and watched him take his last breath. The expression on his face remained calm and did not change at all. He didn't know of Hizongwei's resentment and dissatisfaction before his death. He didn't need to know. The officials who died on the 7th day of the first month in the 11th year of the Qing calendar, including Hizongwei himself, were actually just preparatory work. Hizongwei's death had nothing to do with his likes and dislikes. It was for the people he had to protect. For the people in Jiangnan, Shiliang, and Jingdo who had already died, this official the emperor had raised specifically to deal with Fan Xian had to die. This was just one part of the machine-like calculations. Fan Xian only needed to confirm this person's death. He didn't sigh too much in his heart. There was still time to sigh about things before he died. The scholar stared in a daze at Hizongwei's body. He then turned his head heavily and looked at Fan Xian's icy face with an angry, disappointed, and dazed emotion. An icy voice squeezed out of his chest. Capture this murderer. He stood by Fan Xian's side, disappointed and angry. He gave the order to capture and even kill Fan Xian. He didn't care that Fan Xian could casually stretch out his hand and have him follow Hizongwei in death. Naturally, Fan Xian would not kill him. He looked at the scholar and smiled apologetically. Just as the imperial soldiers charged forward, the head eunuch of the internal court, Eunuch Yao, finally arrived at the Hall of Governmental Affairs. In a sharp voice and powerful jinshi, he yelled, "The emperor has an edict to bring the traitor Fan Xian into the palace." The edict had finally arrived. Without question, this was an edict determined to take his life. However, the edict was for Fan Xian to enter the palace. Everything regarding the emperor and his illegitimate child could not be seen or heard by these officials in court. There was silence in the large room. Countless gazes turned toward Fan Xian's body. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then looked at Eunuch Yao and asked, "Should I tie him up?" Eunuch Yao was silent and didn't say a word. Fan Xian couldn't resist sighing. If he wanted to tie him up, no one could tie him up. However, the emperor's edict could easily turn his family and friends in this world into ropes they could never struggle free of. "I left my umbrella by the door. Don't let someone steal it." After Fan Xian said this, he followed Eunuch Yao deeper into the palace. Behind him, the officials still surrounded Hizongwei's body in incomparable grief. Chapter 731. Last night I had insomnia, unusually serious insomnia. I tossed and turned in bed for a long time, unable to fall asleep. It was not until 10 o'clock this morning that I went back to bed. I slept for a few hours in a daze. Even now, my mind is still muddled. For an optimist like me, insomnia is actually a rare thing. However, since May of last year, it has happened to me. Everything is the fault of Qingyu. I can't help it. I will slowly write this chapter. There is still a long way to go before the end. The winter snow landed on the stone tiles and quickly melted. It was difficult to accumulate. The snowflakes that landed on the bright yellow glazed tiles were frozen in shape by the cold wind. They looked like countless broken clouds waiting calmly in the golden light of the morning sun. Fan Xian withdrew his greedy gaze from admiring the snow. With his hands behind his back, he followed behind Eunuch Yao and quietly circled around the quiet and winding palace walls. Surrounded by the crimson blood, he walked deeper into the royal palace. Behind the two of them, a dozen guards followed carefully. Fan Xian had not been bound. The edict had already named him a traitor. The guards were worried. If Sir Fan Jr. suddenly rose in revolt in the Forbidden Palace, what power did they have to stop him? It was clear that many officials had died in Jingdo. Fan Xian had also shocked the world by publicly killing a scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs at the foot of the royal palace. However, he had no interest in fighting in the royal palace. Perhaps it was because he knew that there were countless aces in this seemingly quiet palace. Perhaps it was because he knew that the emperor in the royal palace was a tall mountain. Before the mountain collapsed, there was no point in making a scene in the palace. The corner of the eaves of Taiji Palace moved with the footsteps of the people on the high palace walls. Walking past a small door and a winter suite with snow, a group of silent people arrived in front of the royal study. Fan Xian waited quietly outside the study. Eunuch Yao glanced at him with a complicated expression. He went forward and said a few words in a low voice to Hong Zhu, who was standing guard at the door of the royal study. His expression changed slightly. Turning back, he lowered his voice and said, "The emperor is waiting for you in the little building." Little building? Fan Xian's gaze did not land on Hong Zhu's face. He did not risk asking with his gaze in front of everyone. Instead, he forced a smile and said, "Then let's go." Eunuch Yao waved his hand and blocked the dozen internal court guards outside the round stone archway. Alone, he led Fan Xian into the rear palace. Behind the two of them, the guards could not hide the nervousness, unease, and suspicion on their faces. Hong Zhu, who had been standing obediently by the door of the royal study, watched Sir Fan Jr.'s back as he walked deep into the palace. An uncontrollable sorrow suddenly surged in his eyes. He quickly lowered his head, terrified that others would see something strange. However, this lowering of his head seemed to be sending Fan Xian off. The inner palace was very quiet after the snow, and one could occasionally hear laughter coming from the depths of the palace. Fan Xian's hearing was so good that he could even hear the sound of mahjong tiles falling to the ground. He couldn't help but laugh. He thought to himself that the things that happened in the capital had not yet reached the palace. Everyone seemed to be having a good time. However, the palace had never been so lively before. He thought to himself that the beauties who had been in the palace for months and the imperial concubines were really in the prime of their youth, diluting the loneliness. Fan Xian liked it this way so that the royal palace would not always be cold and gloomy. The royal palace was as familiar to him as home. The emperor was waiting for him in the little building, so he knew the way. Still holding his hands behind his back like a scholar, he walked unhurriedly toward the northwest corner of the royal palace. Eunuch Yao had fallen behind him. At this time there was no point in rushing. Presumably the emperor would not be in a rush. Coincidentally, the palace was large and the air was cold. There was snow on the winter trees, lakes, and fake mountains. It was much more beautiful than the winter scenery in the palace. Fan Xian could take a few more glances. However, as he walked steadily step by step, Eunuch Yao's gaze, which fell behind him, had an additional meaning. Eunuch Yao sensed that Sir Fan Jr. in front of him was adjusting his breathing. He was using the correspondence between his body and the surrounding environment to allow his realm to rise to a sensitive and abundant level. Eunuch Yao lowered his head even more. He knew why Sir Fan Jr. was slowly walking step by step and adjusting his breathing. Walking past the winter tree garden, around the side of the fake mountains, and onto the wooden stack on the cold lake, he was just about to cross the lake and past the snow pavilion where he had once talked long with the emperor during a snowstorm. Fan Xian suddenly stopped his steps and narrowed his eyes slightly. There were people under the snow pavilion. A few eunuchs and serving girls were accompanying a noble-looking woman to admire the snow. Perhaps there was a warm stove in the pavilion, but the noble-looking woman was still wearing an expensive and warm mink coat. After a moment of surprise, Fan Xian smiled and continued to walk toward the pavilion. He had not thought that he would run into a concubine in the palace on such cold weather. Entering the palace today, he would not go see Yi Gui Pin. He would also not go see Lady Ning and Lady Shu in the cold palace. He had even purposely avoided them. That was why he had chosen this plank path above the lake. Unexpectedly, he had still run into one. Naturally, he would not go and hide. Eunuch Yao followed behind him and did not dare to make a sound for him to choose another path. The two of them entered the pavilion. The people in the pavilion were shocked. It was clear that they had not thought that outsiders would enter the palace at this time. A sharp-eyed serving girl saw Eunuch Yao with his head lowered behind Fan Xian. She quickly half-crouched in greeting and quietly guessed the identity of the young scholar in front of her. Fan Xian stood in the pavilion and also felt surprised. He thought to himself, it has only been a few months, how come the serving girls in the palace have changed so much that they don't even recognize me anymore? As he thought this, his gaze unconsciously landed on the concubine sitting in the middle and refused to leave for a long time. This concubine was about 15 or 16 years old. Her appearance was still young and beautiful. Today she wore hairpins and rings, proper makeup and luxurious clothing. It forcibly brought out a sense of nobility and pride. There was a sense of unsuppressible pride in the concubine's eyes. Looking at Eunuch Yao, she asked, "Has the emperor eaten lunch?" Eunuch Yao did not reply. He only smiled. He thought to himself that it was not a good choice to act like a favored one at this time. The people in the pavilion immediately felt it was strange. Particularly after noticing the young scholar's gaze, they felt incomparably angry. They wondered where such a bastard had come from. Fan Xian stared in a daze at the concubine's slightly bulging belly. Although she was wearing a thick fur coat, he could still see it clearly. He immediately knew that the noble sitting in the pavilion in front of him admiring the snow was the favored concubine Mei. It was this woman who was pregnant with the emperor's dragon seed. There was a deathly silence in the pavilion. Fan Xian looked calmly at concubine Mei's belly for a long time. The expression in his eyes was very complicated. To stare at the emperor's woman so nakedly, particularly at this position, was truly rude. Where did this bastard come from? Where are those thieving eyes looking? A young serving girl stared at Fan Xian and reprimanded him in a sharp voice. Looking at her appearance, she was about to immediately go forward and slap Fan Xian. This serving girl was a servant girl concubine Mei had brought in from outside the palace. These days, the master followed the son's status, and the servant followed the master's status. She was very arrogant and proud in the palace. Even the concubine in Shufang Palace greeted her warmly. She had cultivated an arrogance for a lifetime. She had never seen a man like Fan Xian in the palace. Fan Xian's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked at the serving girl walking toward him with a face full of anger and did not move. Eunuch Yao's heart froze. He had been at the emperor's side these days and had not paid much attention to matters in the back palace. He had not thought that the servants at concubine Mei's side would be so domineering and blind. With a crisp slap, Eunuch Yao floated forward and viciously slapped the serving girl to the ground. He then quickly retreated behind Fan Xian and said in a low and humble voice, "Sir Fan Jr., the emperor is still waiting for you." Fan Xian smiled and glanced at him. "What are you so nervous for? Are you afraid I'll kill her?" Eunuch Yao smiled foolishly and didn't say anything. He thought to himself, "You're adjusting your breathing step by step. The killing intent in your body has long reached a peak and is sealed in your body without a sliver leaking out. If you actually touched a trigger, the casual anger of a superior 9th level ace is not something anyone can withstand." The serving girl was knocked unconscious to the ground. A trickle of blood seeped out of the corner of her mouth. The air in the pavilion seemed to freeze. Concubine Mei stared dumbfounded at this scene. She was so angry that she was confused. She could not understand why Eunuch Yao, the head eunuch of the internal court, would do this. Who was this young man? He dared not kowtow to her and stared at her so rudely. Only the eunuchs and serving girls serving at the side heard clearly the identity that Eunuch Yao had purposely pointed out. They finally knew that this young scholar who had entered the palace alone was the Sir Fan Jr. that the elders in the palace never forgot to warn about. They immediately lowered their heads nervously, not daring to look directly at him. Fan Xian calmly looked at concubine Mei's angry face. He paused for a moment and then said, "It's cold outside. Go back to the palace and play mahjong. If you get sick from the cold here, it won't be good for the child in your stomach. Don't think that the emperor will think you're a bit prettier when he sees you in the pavilion. Don't expect him to dote on you. Life in this palace is actually very simple. You just have to be a bit more obedient." His gaze landed on concubine Mei's stomach again. He couldn't help but smile bitterly and shake his head. It had only been a short time, yet it was already showing. It looked like the emperor was indeed powerful in all areas. However, he didn't know if the child in her stomach would be another brother or sister. "I hope you can give me a sister. I don't have one yet." Fan Xian gave concubine Mei his sincere blessings. He then walked around the people under the pavilion and onto the wooden stack on the other side of the lake, heading toward the northwest corner of the royal palace. Concubine Mei forced herself not to cry with unusual difficulty. Emotions of anger and helplessness piled up in her heart. She unconsciously turned her head to glance at Fan Xian's back and couldn't help but shiver. In the end, she was just a girl of 15 or 16. After hearing the other person's identity from his last words, she involuntarily felt a bit afraid. Ever since she had become pregnant with the Emperor's dragon seed, she was proud on one hand and afraid on the other. She knew what the child in her stomach meant to the person in Shufang Palace, to this foreign official surnamed Fan. She didn't think Fan Xian's last words were any kind of blessing. She only heard them as a warning. She didn't think that Fan Xian truly hoped she could give birth to a princess. After all, if she gave birth to a prince, she would probably sink into the dark strife for the rest of her life and never be able to rise again. Concubine Mei looked with slight fear at the figure disappearing into the snow. The fear in her eyes gradually became unwillingness and hatred. The Qing Emperor was not in the little building. He was in front of the large abandoned palace in the northwest corner of the royal palace, watching the little building. There were few palace buildings here and the winter garden was quiet. There were also fake mountains, but they had long been broken down. It was as if they hadn't been repaired for many years. Compared to the cold palace on the other side, it was even colder. In front of a patch of overgrown grass, Eunuch Yao quietly retreated. Alone, Fan Xian looked at the bright yellow figure between the little building and the long grass. Quietly he walked over and stayed slightly behind. Just like when they were by the seaside in Danzhou, he accompanied him and watched the little building silently. This pair of ruler and official, father and son, were not silent for long. With his hands behind his back, the emperor calmly watched the little building. His thin lips moved slightly as he lightly asked, "Did you see concubine Mei earlier?" "Yes." Fan Xian's hands were also behind his back. Hearing the emperor's question, he calmly replied, "Do you think the child in her stomach is a boy or a girl?" The emperor asked. At this moment the atmosphere was very strange. The father and son had been in a cold war for several months, and countless people had died because of the cold war between the two of them. Yet, when they met today, there was no anger or reprimand that outsiders would expect. They were just casually chatting. "You should be a princess." "Oh? I always knew you were well-learned, but I didn't know you were so wishy-washy." The corners of the emperor's lips twitched slightly as he spoke mockingly. "It can't be said that I am well-learned, but I do have some understanding of medicine. Most importantly, the child in concubine Mei's stomach can only be a princess," Fan Xian replied respectfully. The emperor's brows gradually furrowed. Coldly he said, "In your opinion, I cannot raise someone more successful than the third prince?" "No," Fan Xian replied straightforwardly. "Concubine Mei is not as good as Yi Pin." The emperor was silent for a moment. He then said, "These words are reasonable. However, the royal bloodline is thin. It is always good to have one more prince. If your majesty shows pity, it would be good for the Qing kingdom to have more princes in the future." Fan Xian didn't explicitly say what pity meant. Instead, he lowered his eyelids and straightforwardly said, "Otherwise, if there is another Qingqian or Qingze, it would be meaningless." After these words were said, the emperor's expression quickly darkened. Fan Xian had mentioned the crown prince and the second prince. Although he had single-handedly manipulated the tragic end of these two princes, it had to be said that the emperor's initial training of his sons had completely taken an overly cold-blooded and wrong path. Concerning this, it would be a lie if the gradually aging emperor did not feel a glimmer of emotion in his heart. Fan Xian stood behind the emperor's bleak figure and calmly paid attention to each of the emperor's minute changes. He discovered the hidden pain in the emperor's heart and couldn't help but sigh in his heart. No one in this world was a true god. Even someone as powerful as the emperor had gradually walked the path of a normal old man after stepping down from the throne. The Qing emperor's changes these years had been seen by Fan Xian. It was because he knew of this that he had the courage to come to the palace and say these words to the emperor. These words were like knives cutting into the emperor's heart. In the end, the emperor was not his own way. In just a moment, the emperor's face once again became the eternal and unchanging precipice of Dong Mountain. It was as warm as jade on the outside, but in reality, it was craggy and sharp, disdaining the storm. "His own way is dead?" The emperor slowly opened his mouth and asked. "Yes, your majesty. You thought hard in your manner for 7 days and 7 nights. I was wondering what trick you could think of that would move me. I didn't expect that in the end, it would still be such nonsense." The emperor shook his head and said mockingly, "You have truly disappointed me." Fan Xian smiled shamefully and replied, "Your majesty is like Dong Mountain, unaffected by thousands of years of wind and rain. In the end, I am only a commoner. No matter how much I think, I cannot think of a trick to create something out of nothing. A person's imagination is, in the end, limited. Things that do not exist in this world cannot be thought of no matter how much one thinks." These words were spoken with sincerity. They truly came from the bottom of Fan Xian's heart. Faced with the emperor's great talent and strategy as well as his own strength, it was easier said than done to find a way to defeat him. It was indeed a possibility that did not exist in this world. "I thought for a long time and couldn't think of a way. In the end, I thought it through. Perhaps it is because I have been immersed in the Overwatch Council since I was young that I am used to considering everything thoroughly and only attacking when I am confident." Fan Xian suddenly raised his face. There was a joyous glow on his delicate face. "However, this time is different. I will never be able to find a confident method. Since I will never be able to think of a good method, then why not use the simplest method?" It was the simplest method. 6 simple words, but they contained a deep meaning. What was the simplest method in the world? Naturally, it was to be like a wild beast, using teeth to bite, claws to tear, and carrying out the most primitive and bloody hand-to-hand combat. Fan Xian said these words. This was a breakthrough that came from the bottom of his heart after a defeat. It was a raw and spicy viciousness. It was a kind of reckless energy that he had never displayed before. It was displayed to the fullest. The emperor suddenly calmed down and turned to look at his son calmly. It was as if he was trying to find something different in this familiar face. A moment later, the emperor laughed loudly. There was actually a bit of admiration in his laughter. However, the laughter stopped for a moment. The emperor's voice was particularly cold. To kill an official in front of everyone and disregard the laws of the Qing kingdom, this is the work of the uncivilized, not a hero. Chapter 732. Preposterous people say preposterous things and do preposterous things. On the 7th day of the 1st month in the 11th year of the Qing calendar, Fan Xian ordered his subordinates to assassinate an official on the street and openly kill a scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs at the foot of the royal palace. He had truly done something absurd that had not happened in the Qing court in a century. Yet, he spoke with assurance, boasting that he was acting by imperial edict and cleansing the emperor's side. It was as if he thought these words could explain his actions. It was truly absurd to the extreme. Even though it was so absurd, unexpectedly, the glimmer of a mocking smile rose to the corners of the emperor's lips. He did not get angry. When did I give you an edict? Understanding the emperor's heart is what I and my subordinates should do, Fan Xian replied calmly. Taking advantage of the fact that the defenses in Jingdo had just passed and the palace underestimated his influence and ability to summon old subordinates of the Overwatch Council, he was able to advance like a hurricane and kill all of the core members of the He faction in Jingdo. The main reason he was able to achieve this strategic goal was that Fan Xian's actions had been too sudden. It could even be said to be abrupt. It was so sudden that no one, whether it was in the palace or the court, could have predicted it. That was what Fan Xian was thinking. He had to think of a way out after he failed. He had to be the first to kill all of the officials who were staring at him like hunting dogs and refusing to let go. If he killed them thoroughly enough, if they actually failed in the future, perhaps the lives of the officials and subordinates he wanted to protect would be much better. The clap of thunder rang out, but it did not have the possibility of continuing. It was only a matter of an instant. The court would immediately react. Once the Qing kingdom's powerful national machinery operated at full power and the valiant military power entered Jingdo, Fan Xian's faction's power could only be easily destroyed, particularly in Jingdo. Presumably, the Jingdo garrison had already begun to join forces with the 13 city gate guards to begin the purge operation. The imperial army guarded the palace strictly and would not interfere. But that side alone was enough. Subordinates loyal to Fan Xian had already begun to sneak into the darkness. For Fan Xian this was far from enough. He had to find a way for those loyal to him under the strict Qing law and the emperor's anger. This was the reason why he was saying these absurd things to the emperor. Scholar He's manor keeps 2 vicious dogs and has a reputation for being honest. However, his 2 brothers are also known as vicious dogs in the He family's ancestral county. They have taken the land and beauties and have not been polite to those they should have. The corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched up slightly. As for the matter of selling positions and accepting bribes, although there are no such things during these 3 years, Scholar He's seemingly old manor, there are dozens more famous paintings from the Wei dynasty. Fan Wujiu was one of Cheng Zai's former subordinates. As one of the 8 family generals, although he once left the prince's mansion, he also participated in the rebellion. Scholar knew his identity but he of Emperor. He Emperor and Scholar. Dynasty Emperor, Prince, Emperor, Dynasty. And Scholar he knows this person's identity, yet he secretly tolerates him. I don't know what his intentions are. Fan Xian spoke slowly and calmly. The Overwatch Council had long been investigating He Zongwei. However, due to the emperor's appearance, these things that they had painstakingly investigated could not be exposed to the light of day. Fan Xian was no longer afraid of anything, particularly since he knew that the emperor in front of him knew these things very well, perhaps even better than him. A month ago, Fan Wujiu was attacked by an assassin and almost died. Fan Xian suddenly smiled and gazed at the emperor's profile. The matter of Fan Wujiu being silenced had been ordered by the emperor. Fortunately, one of my subordinates happened to pass by and saved him. In the end, he was able to record a statement. That statement should have been sent to the Overwatch Council by now. When He Zongwei and Sir Peng's widow were being pursued by the Prime Minister's manor, the second prince and Crown Prince Li Hongqing happened to pass by. Now that the person in He Zongwei's manor had been killed, the shadow also happened to pass by. Life was always like this. What makes me even more curious is that Scholar he is not young, yet he has never taken a wife. He even has a concubine and a servant girl, yet he lives with his widowed aunt. Just as Fan Xian was talking endlessly and enthusiastically describing Scholar He's crimes, the emperor finally coldly opened his mouth. Enough. Sir, he wholeheartedly serves the country. Even if he once offended you, in the end he died to your hands. Why use such filthy words to frame a dead person? Your Majesty is right. You should know that I know these things. Yes, your majesty. However, the people do not know that the scholar he that your majesty wholeheartedly favors is such a person. Fan Xian had already restrained the smile on his face. Calmly and without taking a step back he said, I have already sent people to search the He Manor. All the accounts, names and evidence of the crimes have been copied and sent to the Overwatch Council. Presumably, Director Yen will personally send it to the palace before long. As for the original copies, they have already been sent to Dambo Bookstore and Shishan Bookstore. Perhaps somewhere else. In a few days, everyone under heaven will see this. However, Fan Xian still had to speak clearly about the storm in Jingdo. How the court would determine today's killing, even if it was just a slight change in the direction of the wind, would bring a completely different blow to the subordinates loyal to him. The emperor's words were as heavy as the heavens. Shishan Bookstore and Dambo Bookstore had long made preparations to publish them to the world. However, Fan Xian did not want to use a mere name to threaten the emperor. This was an impossible matter. He understood too well the emperor's harsh and merciless nature. Everything was for the benefit of the people. Since He Zongwei was already dead, no matter how much he had received the emperor's favor and appreciation when he was alive, once he became an ice-cold corpse, he was nothing more than a useless servant. The Qing emperor viewed ordinary officials like servants. This was a chilling truth that reached one's heart. How to make sure Scholar He's death did not shake the foundation of the Qing court was the most important thing the emperor considered. Fan Xian was trying to use the strategy he had prepared to persuade the emperor to accept it. As for the crime of poisoning an official, he could not escape. He did not want to escape. His iron-blooded actions had already touched the bottom line of a feudal dynasty. Regardless of whether he stood in the emperor's position or the position of the scholars and officialdom, there was no place for Fan Xian in the vast Qing kingdom. Even more miraculously, the emperor and the royal family always paid attention to a warm and benevolent bearing. Even if a ruler who saw tens of thousands of people as ants, did not care at all about the death of an official and secretly had harsh thoughts, no matter how close an official was, when they made a suggestion, they would carefully pull out the banner of righteousness to hide it. They would not be like Fan Xian who spoke so openly and so lowly. Yet Fan Xian had done it and said it. The emperor did not think much of it and just listened to it casually. In this world, probably only the father and son of the royal family would have such a naked, bloody, and shameless conversation. If someone beside the two of them heard the contents of their conversation, other than being shocked by the content itself, they would certainly notice another serious problem. In the Winter Palace, ever since they had spoken, Fan Xian had not been polite, bowed, knelt, or referred to himself as an official. He only referred to himself as I. He responded indifferently and spoke from the bottom of his heart. The emperor allowed Fan Xian's impudence because there was a faint coldness in the depths of his eyes. He only waved his hand with some disgust. Perhaps other people could not understand the meaning behind each of the emperor's actions, but Fan Xian was different. He quickly straightened his body. His expression recovered its calmness and his spirits rose slightly. He knew that there would be some deviation in the judgment of today's matter. Although the crime was only slightly off, there was a great difference in the degree of the court openly arresting him and secretly attacking him. A gust of cold wind blew past. The snow on the long grass behind the two of them was picked up and landed on their bodies, adding a sense of coldness and harshness. If the dead He Zongwei knew that the emperor he had been loyal to and Fan Xian who had killed him, had only used a conversation to make it impossible for him to die a clean death, the grievance in his heart would probably grow even stronger. However, this was a feudal dynasty. This was the so-called family world. In the eyes of this shameless father and son, regardless of whether it was in officialdom or among the people, the Qing emperor or Fan Xian's reputation was more powerful than He Zongwei, a newly popular official. As for whether or not such a way of handling it would chill the hearts of the officials, that was a problem for the palace to handle in the future. The snow continued to fall slowly and coldly. The emperor slowly turned around and looked silently at Fan Xian, who was about the same height as him. He didn't speak for a long time. Usually, when Fan Xian was in front of the emperor, he couldn't help but bend his body slightly or lower his head. Now Fan Xian stood with his back straight. Only then did the emperor realize that his son had long been the same height as him. An intimidating coldness and pressure emanated from the man in the bright yellow dragon robe, soldering Fan Xian to the snow and grass. This aura was not purposely emanated. Instead, it moved according to the change in his state of mind and emotions. An incomparably powerful substance borrowed the power to reveal itself. It wanted to affect the surrounding environment. Fan Xian's expression did not change. Calmly and seriously he breathed in the air amidst the snow. The father and son had talked for a long time. They both knew that this moment would eventually come. Now that He Zhongwei's matter had been resolved, it was time for the matter between the two of them. I'm very curious. You have entered the palace alone to face me. What exactly do you have to serve me? The emperor's expression was calm. Very naturally, it was tilted slightly and filled with mockery and disdain. I have nothing to rely on at all. Fan Xian slowly closed his eyes. After a moment of silence, he took a deep breath and bravely opened his eyes. Looking straight at the unfathomable ruler in front of him, he said in a quiet, almost numb voice, I just want to have a fair battle with your majesty. A fair battle? A fair battle? After a slight pause, the emperor found it difficult to suppress his laughter. The laughter was deep and profound, filled with absurdity. It echoed through the royal palace in the depths of winter, waking up countless little creatures hibernating in the frozen earth. The emperor's eyes narrowed slightly. A strange smile flashed through the corners of his clear eyes. In a slightly raspy voice he said, What right do you have for me to ask for fairness? Yes, in front of the emperor, what right did Fan Xian have to ask for fairness? His sister was still in the palace and his family was still in the capital. Although his subordinates had been impudent today in the emperor's eyes, they were still a group of ants that could not cause any waves. It was precisely because the emperor was confident and powerful that he did not care about the turmoil in Jingdo. As long as he wanted to, he could easily move an army. Using the power of the world in his hands, he could suppress Fan Xian firmly and make him unable to move at all. The words a fair battle were arrogant, valiant, and childish. The imperial royal palace was not the wild Jianghu. If you wanted to fight and the emperor disdained to fight you, what could you do? Fan Xian's expression did not change. Calmly and unswervingly, he returned the emperor's gaze and said each word clearly, qualifications lie in strength. I think I still have the strength to happily seek death. As these words left his mouth, the emperor's eyes narrowed slightly. His deep gaze naturally swept past Fan Xian's shoulder and looked toward the continuous cluster of palaces in the southeast. The palace, which should have been bustling, was incomparably quiet in the snow. There were no sudden noises or strange movements. However, the emperor's heart jumped slightly. He knew that something had gone wrong. Fan Xian had entered the palace alone to seek a quick revenge with blood spilled on the ground. He had long prepared a path of retreat and a bargaining chip to demonstrate his qualifications. If the world was a game of chess, the chessboard placed between the father and son was 7 roads of territory, 3 powers and countless provinces. The chess pieces were billions of people, endless wealth, and the hearts of the people. Fan Xian's actions, other than valiant, were to take back this chessboard from the world and turn it into the cold soil of the royal palace where his feet stood. He wanted to remove the chess pieces from the chessboard, leaving only himself and the Qing emperor. This was his ruthlessness and decisiveness. Ruthlessness toward himself and decisiveness toward the emperor. In order to make the emperor abandon the chessboard of the world and ensure the safety of the chess pieces, Fan Xian had to have enough bargaining chips to convince him. This included He Zhongwei's death. If Fan Xian did not bring out sufficient proof, then he did not have the right to say these words. The first bargaining chip Fan Xian tossed out was a fire. It was a fire in winter. This fire was burning in a quiet but heavily guarded room somewhere in the royal palace. A dozen internal court aces, who never cared about worldly affairs and were only responsible for guarding the things in the room, watched with confusion as the flames gradually spat out from the window. They knew it was over for them. Not long after, the fire in the room was extinguished. However, the files and books inside had already been completely burned, leaving not a single trace behind. The emperor's gaze gazed at the hall in the southeast corner. After a while, black smoke rose. The black smoke dispersed into the snowflakes and disappeared without a trace. His gaze finally gradually became cold and serious. Not many people in the palace know where the palace treasury's records of the technological process are stored. The emperor's gaze did not fall on Fan Xian's face. He only coldly said, "For you to be able to find it and burn it with a fire, it truly surprises me." Fan Xian stood to the side and said, "There are only 2 copies of the palace treasury's technological process. One is in North Min and the other is in the palace. Since I can burn the one in the palace, I can also burn the one in North Min regardless of whether Su Wenmao is dead or not. I trust that your majesty understands that I have the power to do all of this in Jiangnan and the palace treasury." Finishing these words, Fan Xian looked at the emperor's expressionless face and sighed in his heart. The palace treasury was the foundation of the Qing kingdom. Suddenly hearing that the foundation had been damaged, the emperor remained as calm as usual. Such a realm of bearing was truly extraordinary. How could he, a mortal, resist it? You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.